Crescent moon hook, a gentle beginning. Close your eyes and let the weight of the day slip softly away. Imagine yourself drifting into a time long before clocks ticked, before machines roared, before the world was restless and loud. In this story, we will wander together, not quickly, not with urgency, but with the unhurried step of dreamers. We are going back to the eternal city, to a Rome that is half legend, half memory, a Rome that rises in the mist of the Tiber River. It is not the Rome of noise and battles, not the Rome of shouting generals and clashing swords. No, this is a softer Rome, a Rome told as one might tell a bedtime tale, where the stones of the old city breathe gently, where history comes not as thunder, but as a lullaby. And so, as you breathe slowly, as you let your body sink deeper into rest, let us begin the long and winding tale, the soft history of ancient Rome. Chapter 1. The birth of a city long, long ago. Before the city of Rome stood in its glory, the land was quiet. The hills lay untouched, cloaked in soft grasses, and the Tiber River wound slowly, its waters glimmering in the silver light of the moon. The air was gentle, the nights were deep, and the earth seemed to wait, patiently, for something yet to come. In those days, stories lived in whispers. Shepherds told tales around their fires. Old men, leaning on their staffs, spoke of wandering gods, and children listened wide-eyed to the voices that drifted through the valleys. And among these stories one rose higher, softer, more mysterious than the rest, the tale of two brothers, Romulus and Remus. The story begins not with kings or cities, but with silence, and with a river. For it was upon the slow-flowing Tiber that the twins were set adrift, their cradle carried like a leaf upon the water. Some say they were the sons of Mars, the god of war, though nothing in their infancy spoke of violence. Instead, they were fragile, small and alone, wrapped in fate as in a blanket. The river carried them without haste until the waters brought them gently to rest beneath the shade of a fig tree. And there, in the stillness, came the strangest of guardians, a she-wolf, wild and strong, yet tender in that moment. She lowered her head, her eyes soft with mystery, and she gave them milk as though they were her own. Imagine it now, in your mind's slow vision. Two tiny boys, their cries fading into the hush of the night, and the wolf, silent and patient, watching over them. It is a picture of beginnings, half fierce, half tender, entirely unforgettable. As time passed, the twins grew, and they were taken in by a shepherd and his wife. The shepherd's hut was humble, the hearth fire low, but it was enough. The boys learned the earth, the hills, the ways of sheep and dogs. Yet, deep within them, there was always something greater stirring, a restless sense that they were meant for more than the quiet life of tending flocks. Years drifted on, slowly as dreams drift between night and morning. Romulus and Remus became strong, became bold, and at last they felt the call to build something of their own. They returned to the banks of the Tiber, where once they had floated helpless, and there they decided, a city shall rise. But even in dreams, even in soft tellings, the world carries quarrels. For Romulus wished the city to stand upon one hill, and Remus upon another. The argument was not loud in this telling. It was more like the steady pressing of two wills, firm and unyielding. In the end, it was Romulus who prevailed, though at a cost, for his brother did not live to see the city grow. And so, Romulus gave his name to the city. Rome, a simple word, a lasting word, one that would echo across centuries. The first stones were placed, the first walls raised, not in thunder, but in quiet determination. From the riverbank and the soft hills, the eternal city began. It was not yet marble, it was not yet empire. It was only beginnings. Wooden huts, smoky fires, simple paths winding between them. But the spirit was already there, waiting, whispering, promising. For in every stone, in every shadow, the dream of Rome had already been born. The beginning of Rome is not a tale of armies, not a tale of emperors, not yet the roar of crowds in marble theatres. No, the beginning of Rome is softer, older, more like the hushed tone of an ancient lullaby told beside the flicker of a hearth fire. It begins with silence, and then with a river. The Tiber flows gently through the Italian land, a quiet ribbon of silver winding between hills. In the evenings of long ago, when no walls yet rose upon the 7 hills, shepherds would bring their flocks to drink at its banks. The air was still, touched only by the rustling of reeds, the slow murmur of water against a stone, and the call of distant birds returning to their nests. It was upon this river, quiet and unhurried, that destiny set its cradle afloat. Inside were 2 infants, Romulus and Remus, twins bound by fate. Their story begins not with triumph, but with fragility, for they were cast away, abandoned to the flow of the river, as though the gods themselves wished to test whether these small lives could survive. Imagine, if you will, the slow rocking of the wooden cradle upon the water. It drifts gently, swaying left and right as the current carries it forward. The boys do not know yet of greatness, do not know yet of struggle. They are only sleeping, only breathing softly, unaware of the river's watchful journey. The cradle comes to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill beneath a tree, the fig tree called Ficus ruminalis. The place is quiet, half-shadowed, as though the world itself is holding its breath. And here, in this hush, comes one of the most wondrous images in all of Rome's soft history, the she-wolf. She does not arrive with menace, not in this telling. No, she comes as though drawn by something greater, something eternal. Her fur glistens in the dim light, her paws press softly into the earth, and her eyes are deep, not wild but strangely gentle. She lowers her head to the infants. She gives them milk. She warms them with her body. She keeps them alive. This is how Rome begins, not with swords, not with fire, but with the unlikely kindness of a wild creature. The twins survive, and from that survival, the story flows onward. Later, the twins are found by a shepherd named Faustulus and his wife, Acca Laurentia. Their hut is small, their life humble, but their hearth is warm. In this soft version of the story, we linger not on hardship, but on the quiet rhythms of simple life. The smoke curls from the chimney, bread bakes slowly on the fire. The boys grow, day by day, chasing sheep on the hills, learning the sound of wind in the grass, the call of birds, the footsteps of foxes in the night. They do not yet know who they are. They do not yet know they are sons of Mars, or that their mother was the Vestal Rhea Silvia. They only know the life of shepherds, the calm days and long nights under stars that seemed endless. And yet, deep within them, something stirs. Romulus and Remus grow strong, not only in body but in spirit. Their laughter carries across the hills, their steps are swift, their voices firm. They are different, and the people around them begin to sense it, though no one can yet say why. Time moves slowly, as it does in all beginnings. The boys grow into men, and at last they learn the truth of their birth. The blood of kings, the breath of gods, the shadow of fate, it all flows within them. The quiet days of shepherd life can no longer hold them. Something greater calls, and so they return to the place where the cradle once rested, the place where the wolf once nursed them. The Palatine Hill rises gently above the river, crowned with grass and stones, and here they decide, a city shall be made, a city of walls, of homes, of hearths, of dreams, a city that shall endure. But fate, even in its softness, does not move without shadows. Romulus and Remus, bound by blood, are also bound by quarrel. They do not agree on where the city should stand. Romulus looks to the Palatine, Remus looks to the Aventine. Their voices, though calm at first, grow firm, and in the still air of destiny there is tension. In some tellings, omens decide. Birds fly above the hills, and the brothers count them. Romulus sees more, or claims to. In other tellings, the quarrel is harsher, and in the end, the story turns dark. Romulus strikes his brother, and Remus falls. The city that will stand eternal begins with loss. It is a heavy thing, yet told in softness. It feels almost inevitable, like the turning of seasons, like the fading of day into night. Romulus is left alone, his brother gone, his heart heavy yet unbending, and with solemn hands he begins to build. He marks the boundaries of the city. He raises its first walls. He gives it his name, Rome. At first, Rome is nothing grand. Wooden huts, smoky hearths, narrow paths winding between them, chickens in the dust, children laughing by the river, the smell of cooking fires. But beneath this simplicity lies a spirit strong and unyielding. A promise, a seed. The city is fragile, like the cradle once was, yet it carries within it the breath of destiny. For from these huts, from these stones, from this soft beginning will rise the mightiest empire the world has ever known. And so ends the first chapter of our soft history, not in triumph, but in the quiet placing of the first stone. Rome is born, and though its future will be filled with storms and battles, tonight it is only a dream, resting lightly upon the banks of the Tiber. The beginning of Rome is a tale best told slowly, like a story whispered late at night when the fire has burned low and the world outside is hushed. We are not in the Rome of marble, not in the Rome of emperors, not yet in the Rome of conquest. We are at the very beginning, when the city was only a thought, a dream drifting on the quiet waters of the Tiber River. The land was still wild then. The hills stood empty, their slopes covered with grasses, oak trees, and the tracks of animals. No, the Palatine, the Aventine, the Capitoline, Names that would one day resound with glory were then only silent hills waiting in patience. The sky stretched wide and endless, and the nights were long, filled with the music of insects and the distant cry of wolves. And it is fitting, perhaps, that a wolf should be at the heart of Rome's beginning. But before the wolf, there was a woman. Her name was Rhea Silvia, daughter of Numitor, king of Alba Longa. She lived in troubled times, for her uncle Amulius had seized the throne, driven out her father, and forced her into the service of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. As a Vestal virgin, she was sworn to chastity, sworn to tend the sacred flame. Yet fate, and the gods, had other designs. Some say it was Mars, the god of war himself, who came to her. Others say it was but a tale to explain what could not be explained. Whatever the truth, Rhea Silvia bore twin sons, Romulus and Remus. To Amulius, the usurper, this was dangerous. He feared these children would grow, would rise, would reclaim the throne for their grandfather, and so he ordered them cast into the river, left to die. But destiny flows like water. What is meant to be will find a way. The basket holding the twins was set upon the Tiber. The current took it gently, rocking it left and right, carrying it through reeds and shadows, past stones slick with moss. It did not capsize, it did not sink, though the river was strong. Instead, it glided softly until it came to rest at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, beneath a fig tree, the sacred Ficus ruminalis, the basket tipped, and the infants cried out into the stillness. And here comes the image that has lived for centuries. The she-wolf. In most tales, the wolf is wild, fierce, dangerous. Yet in this one moment, she is something else entirely. She lowers her head, sniffs the tiny forms, and instead of devouring, she nurtures. She gives them her milk, warm and sustaining. Her body shields them from the cold. Her breath is steady, her presence fierce yet protective. Two helpless infants cradled not by a mother of flesh and blood, but by the strange mercy of the wild. One may imagine the scene in dreamlike stillness, the silver moon above, the river flowing quietly, the wolf crouched low, the infants pressed against her belly. A picture half myth, half memory, yet so enduring that it feels truer than fact. But wolves do not linger forever. Soon after, the twins were discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus. He lifted them gently, carried them to his hut, and with his wife, Laurentia, raised them as his own. Their childhood was not filled with riches, not with palaces or marble, but with the simple rhythms of shepherd life. In the mornings, the boys would follow their father into the fields, watching the sheep move slowly across the slopes. The grass bent in the wind, the sun warmed the earth, and the dogs barked as they guided the flock. The twins learned to climb rocks, to leap over streams, to chase after the shadows of deer. Their laughter echoed through the valleys, bright and strong. At night they would sit by the fire. Laurentia would tell them stories of gods and heroes, of the old city of Alba Longa, of the hearth that must never be allowed to die. The flames crackled, the smoke curled upward, and the boys listened with wide eyes. They did not yet know who they truly were, but something in their hearts stirred when these tales were told. They were different. Everyone could see it. They grew taller, stronger, swifter than other children. When disputes arose among the shepherds, it was Romulus and Remus who stepped forward to resolve them. When wolves threatened the flock, it was the twins who drove them away. They carried themselves with a natural command, a quiet authority, as though fate already whispered in their ears. But fate cannot remain hidden forever. One day, Remus was captured during a quarrel with herdsmen loyal to King Amulius. He was taken before the usurper himself. There, in Alba Longa, the truth of his birth began to surface. Romulus gathered men to free his brother, and in the struggle that followed, Amulius was slain. Numitor, their grandfather, was restored to his throne. The twins, however, did not linger. Alba Longa was not their destiny. Alba Longa was not there. Something greater called them. They returned to the place where their cradle had rested, where the wolf had nursed them. The Palatine Hill by the Tiber River. There they felt it. This was the place. Here, a city must rise. Yet even brothers bound by blood and story can quarrel. Romulus wished the city to stand upon the Palatine. Remus preferred the Aventine. They sought signs from the gods. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus saw 12. Each claimed victory. Words grew sharper. Wills grew sharper. Wills grew harder. And then the sorrowful Remus, mocking his brother, leapt over the half-built walls of Romulus' city as if to show how weak they were. In anger, Romulus struck him down. The dream of 2 brothers building a city together ended in silence and loss. Remus lay still, and Romulus, heavy of heart, became the sole founder. It is said he looked upon his brother's body and whispered words of grief. It is said he buried him with honour. But the city could not wait. With solemn determination, Romulus marked the sacred boundary, the Palmarium. He dug the first trench, placed the first stones, raised the first huts. He named the city Rome, after himself perhaps, or after the river, or after some name long forgotten. Whatever its origin, the name endured. Rome, short, firm, eternal. At first, Rome was small. A few huts of wood and straw, a hearth fire burning in the centre, chickens scratching in the dust, children laughing by the river, the smell of smoke, of bread, of wool drying in the sun. To the eye, it was ordinary. To the spirit, it was immense. For in this fragile beginning lay a promise that one day this city would stretch across continents, that its roads would run like veins through the world, that its language and its law would shape centuries yet unborn. But tonight, in this telling, we do not rush ahead. We linger here in the hush of the first days. We see Romulus walking slowly among the huts, speaking with the first citizens. We see the smoke rising gently above the hill. We hear the river flowing softly below. The city is only a seed, but it is alive. And perhaps, if we close our eyes, we can still imagine the she-wolf watching from the shadows of the hill, her eyes glowing faintly, guarding what she once saved. The city of destiny, born from abandonment, nurtured by the wild, raised by shepherds, forged in loss, and begun in quiet determination. Thus ends the first chapter of our soft history. A beginning not of thunder, but of whispers. A city not yet eternal, but already unforgettable. Crescent Moon, Chapter 2. The early kings, after Romulus laid the first stones of Rome, after he traced the sacred boundary of the city with his plough and named it after himself, the story of Rome did not rest. It moved forward slowly but steadily, like the river that had once carried him and his brother. The city grew first with huts, then with people, then with order. But for a city to live, for it to be more than wood and fire and dust, it needed leaders. It needed kings. And so in Rome's earliest days, before the Republic, before the Caesars, there was the age of the 7 kings. These kings were not emperors in marble palaces. They were closer to shepherds and warriors, to fathers and lawgivers, men who ruled when Rome was still young, still fragile, still finding its voice. Their reigns were woven of legend and memory, half history, half myth. And in the soft telling of the story, they feel less like rulers and more like dream figures, each shaping the city with a gentle hand, each leaving behind something that would never fade. Romulus was the first. He had named the city, now he breathed life into it. In those days, Rome had few women, for the people were mostly wandering men, shepherds and exiles who sought refuge there. A city cannot grow without families, and Romulus, in his stern yet visionary way, found a solution. He invited the neighbouring Sabines to a festival, and during the games, the Romans seized their women. It was an act harsh and unsettling, yet in the soft retelling, it becomes not a tale of cruelty, but of union. For when anger rose and battles followed, it was the women themselves who stepped between fathers and husbands, pleading for peace, and their voices carried more weight than swords. The Sabines joined with the Romans, and from this union the city grew stronger. Romulus ruled long, guiding his people with firm hand and warrior's strength. He divided them into tribes, set down the first laws, and built the Senate, a council of elders to advise him. And when at last his reign ended, the stories say he did not die as men do. One day in the midst of his people, he vanished in a storm, taken up into the sky, and the Romans whispered that their king had become a god, watching forever from above as Quirinus, protector of the city that bore his name. After Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a king unlike the first. Where Romulus was fire and sword, Numa was calm and water. He was a man of peace, a man of prayer, who sought not conquest but harmony. He built temples, not walls. He gave Rome its first priests, its sacred rites, its calendar that measured days and months by the movements of the moon. He taught the people to honour the gods, to keep the hearth flame of Vesta burning, to cherish order over chaos. In his reign, the people learned not only how to live, but how to live together, bound by faith and ritual. Numa, gentle and wise, made Rome's spirit softer, steadier, preparing it for the storms that would one day come. Then came Tullus Hostilius, and with him returned the fire of war. Tullus was a warrior king, restless and bold, who believed Rome must grow through strength. His reign is remembered for the duel between 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, and 3 Alban brothers, the Curiatii. Rather than let whole armies clash, each side sent forth their champions, and the fight decided the fate of Alba Longa, the old city of the twins' grandfather. The Romans prevailed, and Alba became Rome's own. Under Tullus, Rome stretched further, but with fire came also ruin. For when Tullus neglected the gods and their rites, lightning struck his house, and he was gone. His reign, though fierce, ended in a storm of flame. After him, another contrast. Ancus Marcius, the 4th king, blended war and peace, strength and wisdom. He was said to be the grandson of Numa, and he carried both a warrior's arm and a priest's heart. Ancus built bridges across the Tiber, bringing people together. He founded colonies by the sea, giving Rome its first taste of salt air, its first touch of trade. He strengthened the walls but also opened the city to outsiders, making Rome not only a fortress but a home for many. In Ancus, the balance of Rome deepened. It was no longer just a shepherd's village, no longer just a warrior's camp, but a growing city with roads, bridges and breadth. Then came the kings not born Roman. The 5th king was Tarquinius Priscus, said to be of Etruscan blood, a man of vision who came to Rome seeking a place in its story. He brought new splendour, new ideas, new craft. He doubled the Senate, built great works, and began the Circus Maximus, where chariots would one day thunder in endless races. Under him, Rome grew not only in power but in wonder, for the Etruscan touch gave it art, ceremony, and grandeur. Tarquin's reign showed that Rome was not closed but open, able to take in the strength of others and make it its own. After him reigned Servius Tullius, a king of mysterious birth, said to have once been a slave, yet chosen by destiny to wear the crown. Servius gave Rome its true shape, dividing the people into classes, organising them by wealth, binding them into a body greater than themselves. He built the great Servian wall, encircling the hills, giving Rome a visible form, a skin around its growing bones. He was both builder and reformer, a king who shaped the structure of the city's heart. His reign was long, his deeds many, but in the end, he too fell to ambition and betrayal, for his own daughter and her husband, Tarquinius Superbus, conspired against him. And so the 7th and last king came, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. His name itself tells the tale. He ruled with iron, with pride, with tyranny. He silenced the Senate. He ruled without counsel. He drove his people with harshness. His reign was heavy, and though he built temples, though he gave Rome grandeur, he did so with cruelty. His fall was born not from battle but from outrage, for when his son dishonoured a noblewoman named Lucretia, the Roman people rose. They cast out the king, they swore never again to bow to one man, and thus the kings were ended. Rome would no longer be ruled by crowns, but by the people, by the republic that would endure for centuries, thus past the age of the 7 kings. In their stories, half legend, half memory, lies the childhood of Rome. Romulus, the founder, Numa, the priest, Tullus, the warrior, Ancus, the bridge builder, Tarquin, the elder, the dreamer, Servius, the reformer, Tarquin, the proud, the fallen. Each left something behind, each added a stone to the foundation. Together they shaped the soul of the city, strength and faith, order and ambition, pride and downfall. And when we tell it softly, as in a dream, it feels less like the harsh march of history, and more like the slow unfolding of a great storybook, each king a page, each reign a verse. The huts have grown into houses, the fires have grown into temples, the narrow paths have become roads. The river still flows, but now bridges cross it. The hills still stand, but now they hold walls and towers. Rome is no longer a cradle, no longer a child. Rome is becoming, and so as the chapter closes, the city rests in its youth. It has known founders and priests, warriors and tyrants, and priests, warriors and tyrants. It has seen peace and war, growth and betrayal. But it stands stronger than before, and in the distance, the story of Rome stretches onward, waiting. Life under the early kings of Rome was not grand, not yet clothed in marble or gold. All was simple, almost quiet, touched by the sounds of animals, by the rhythm of footsteps, by the smoke curling slowly from hearth fires. To walk through the city then was not to hear the roar of crowds, but the bleating of goats, the murmur of families, the chatter of children running barefoot across the dust. The houses were small, made of wood and straw, their roofs thatched, their walls humble. Inside, the hearth was the heart. Around it, families gathered to eat their meals, bread baked on stones, porridge made from grain, olives, cheese, perhaps a little meat if fortune was kind. The taste of salt was rare, the sweetness of honey a treasure, the simplest foods cherished as gifts of the earth. In the mornings, men rose early to tend the fields or guide their flocks. They worked slowly, carefully, cutting grain, mending fences, leading sheep to water. The sound of tools striking wood, of sickles slicing through stalks, of dogs barking at strays. These were the sounds of Rome before it was an empire. Women spun wool, wove cloth, ground grain with heavy stones. Children fetched water from the river, carrying jars that gleamed in the sunlight. Life was steady, ordinary, yet within it was a quiet dignity, a patience that built more than walls. Festivals marked the passing of the seasons. On certain days, the people would gather to honour the gods, offering small sacrifices of grain, of milk, of wine, if they had it. They sang simple hymns, their voices rising gently against the hills. At night, torches flickered, fires burned bright, and stories were told, of gods and heroes, of wolves and kings, of Romulus taken into the sky. The city was not only a place of work, but of memory, of shared breath, of ritual. Under Numa, these rituals grew deeper. The people learned to measure their days by the calendar he gave them. They knew when to plant and when to harvest, when to fast and when to fast and when to feast. The temple fires burned steady and eternal, a symbol of Rome's heartbeat. Even the poorest family could look to the flame and feel they were part of something larger, something lasting. Under Tullus, life grew harsher. The men were called more often to fight, to march, to defend the city's honour. Yet even in these times daily life continued. Mothers still told stories to their children, still taught them how to weave, how to pray. Farmers still bent their backs to the earth, still watched the skies for rain. The clash of war was never far, but so too was the comfort of ordinary things, bread baking, water flowing, voices humming old songs. Ancus brought bridges, and with bridges came change. The river was no longer only a boundary, but a pathway. Traders came with goods, salt, fish, tools, cloth. Fish, tools, cloth. Children saw new faces, new colours, heard new words. The city began to feel less like a village and more like a gathering place of many peoples. Life under Ancus was still simple, still rooted in earth and fire, but there was now a sense of reaching outward, of Rome stretching its arms to the world beyond. Under the Tarquins, the city grew larger, louder. The Circus Maximus began to rise, and though at first it was only a dusty track, people gathered to watch horses run, to cheer, to laugh, to forget for a moment their labours. Imagine the scene, the smell of dust and sweat, the sound of hooves striking earth, the roar of voices rising into the air. It was not yet the grand circus of later times, but it was a glimpse of what Rome could become, a place not only of work and worship, but of spectacle, of shared delight. Servius gave the city its walls, and with them came safety. At night, families slept more soundly, knowing stones stood between them and the darkness beyond. Children played along the new streets, chasing each other through the gates. Merchants set up stalls, offering bread, olives, clay pots, and woven baskets. The city was beginning to breathe like a single body, its people bound together not only by fear of enemies but by shared hope. And yet, under Tarquin, the proud life grew heavy. The people still rose in the mornings, still tended fields, still lit fires and baked bread, but they did so under a shadow. The king's cruelty pressed upon them. The joy of festivals dimmed. Even in their homes, even in their small huts, the people felt the weight of a ruler who thought only of power. And it was in these quiet, ordinary lives that rebellion was born. For when Lucretia's honour was broken, when her sorrow spread like fire, it was not only nobles who were outraged, but farmers, shepherds, mothers, fathers, all who wished for a city where pride would no longer crush the spirit. And so, when the kings were cast out, it was not only the Senate who cheered, not only the warriors who swore new oaths, but the families in their huts, the children in the dust, the women at their hearths. The people themselves breathed lighter. A new chapter had begun, and though the Republic would bring its own struggles, its own storms, the memory of kings, their strength, their wisdom, their failings, would always linger. Looking back on those early days, it is as though each reign was a dream in a long night, each king a figure walking softly across the stage of memory. Romulus, fierce and vanishing into the storm, Numa, calm and gentle with firelight on his face, Tullus, burning with war and falling to flame, Ancus, building bridges across water, Tarquin the elder, bringing grandeur from afar, Servius, drawing walls with patient hands, Tarquin the proud, standing tall before his final fall. They are less like rulers now, more like shadows in a story, yet without them, the city would not have been, and so the chapter rests here. Rome has known its kings, has grown from huts to walls, from fire to temples, from quarrels to unity. And it is no longer the cradle by the river. It is a city awake, though still young. Its streets are narrow, its houses plain, but its spirit is vast. In the hush of night, if you stand upon the Palatine and look out, you can see the glow of hearth fires across the hills, smoke rising gently into the sky, and you know that something eternal has begun. The kings were gone. Their thrones stood empty, their crowns cast aside, their voices silenced by the will of the people. And in the quiet that followed, Rome breathed a new breath, a breath not of command from one, but of the many. This was the birth of the Republic, not sudden like a thunderclap, but slow and steady, like the rising of dawn. The Romans had seen the strength of kings, but they had also felt the weight of pride and cruelty. They wished now for balance, for a way of life where no man could rise so high that he might trample all others, and so they created something new, something fragile, something never before tested in their small world, a government of shared power. 2 men called consuls would rule together, each a check upon the other. Their term was short, 1 year only, so that no voice could linger too long, no hand could hold the city in its grasp. Imagine the people gathering in the forum, their voices murmuring as names were spoken, as choices were weighed. It was not like the thunderous votes of later days, but a simpler thing. Men casting their stones, raising their hands, speaking their favour. There was excitement in the air, for now the people themselves, at least those free and of age, could feel their will shaping Rome. The Republic was not perfect, not equal, not yet fair to all, but it was a step away from the shadow of tyranny, and the Romans cherished it. The Senate, too, grew in strength. No longer an advisor to kings, it now guided consuls, debated laws, weighed decisions. The old men of Rome, robed in white, gathered beneath the open sky, their words drifting upward like smoke. Their voices were calm, deliberate, steady, and in their careful speech one could hear the pulse of Rome, slower than the beat of war drums, softer than the cries of victory, yet steady and enduring. But beyond these halls of power, life continued in its gentle rhythm. Families still woke at dawn. Families still woke at dawn. Farmers still bent to their fields, hands pressing into soil, scattering seed, guiding oxen to plough. Women still spun wool and baked bread, their songs carrying through the narrow streets. Children still played, chasing one another around fountains, rolling hoops across the dust, laughing as their voices echoed off stone walls. Yet something subtle had changed. For though the huts and houses looked the same, though the meals of porridge and olives remained, the people carried in their hearts a new sense of belonging. They were citizens now, not subjects. Rome belonged not to a king but to them all, and this feeling, this quiet pride, made even the poorest man stand taller. The first years of the Republic were fragile, uncertain. Enemies beyond the hills watched, waiting to see if this experiment would fail. Neighbouring towns sent raiders, testing Rome's strength. Inside the city, quarrels stirred between rich and poor, between patricians with their wealth and plebeians with their toil. The Senate and the people often stood apart, their voices raised, their desires clashing. Yet in this tension, something new was forged, something stronger than iron, the Roman spirit. Picture a poor farmer, rising before dawn to walk into the forum, his hands still rough from the soil. He listens as patricians argue over laws, as consuls speak of treaties and wars. He feels small, perhaps, but he also feels heard. In time, plebeians will fight for their rights, will demand a voice of their own, and out of that struggle will come the tribunes, protectors of the people. But even now, in these early days, the seeds of equality are sown. And still, the gods watched. Festivals continued, sacrifices offered, rituals performed with careful hands. The temples grew grander, their columns lifting skyward, their marble gleaming in the sun. Fires burned upon altars, smoke rising to the heavens. The people prayed for good harvests, for safety in war, for peace in their homes. The Republic may have been new, but the old faiths held firm, grounding the city in memory and tradition. In those first years, Rome was tested often. Wars with neighbouring tribes were frequent. The Latin League, the Sabines, the Etruscans, all challenged the young Republic. And yet, Rome endured. When one consul fell in battle, another rose. When the city feared, its people gathered, lifting shields, lifting voices, refusing to bow. Slowly, steadily, the Romans came to believe that their strength lay not in kings, but in unity, in the sharing of burden and honour alike. Daily life reflected this spirit. Men trained not only for themselves but for their city. The farmers became soldiers when called, then returned to their ploughs when the campaign was done. Women tended not only their homes but the memory of Rome, teaching children the stories of its past, the duties of its future. Festivals became more than celebrations. They were reminders of shared identity, of the bond between citizen and city. The Forum, once only a gathering place, now became the heart of the Republic. Merchants spread their goods there. Fruits, grain, cloth, pottery, while citizens debated laws, while priests tended shrines, while children played between the columns. It was noisy, crowded, alive, a mirror of Rome itself, imperfect, quarrelsome, but full of vigour. At night, when the torches flickered along the streets and the city grew quiet, one could feel the new breath of the Republic more keenly. Families sat together by their hearths, speaking in low voices of the day's debates, the consul's decisions, the Senate's words. Even those with little power felt connected to something greater, as though each voice, no matter how small, added to the song of Rome. It was not always peaceful. The patricians guarded their privileges, plebeians pushed for more rights, quarrels turned to protests, protests at strikes. There were moments when the Republic seemed ready to tear itself apart. And yet, each time, some compromise was found, some bridge built between rich and poor. For the Romans, though stubborn and proud, loved their city too much to see it fall, and so the Republic endured. Year by year, it grew stronger, more complex, more confident. Its citizens learned that freedom was not easy, that self-rule was a burden as much as a gift. But they also learned that in sharing that burden, in carrying it together, they became more than individuals. They became Rome. And if you walked then through the streets at dawn, when the first light touched the temples and the hills, you would feel it. You would see it in the faces of men and women, in the voices of children, in the steady rhythm of daily life. Rome was awake. Not yet the empire, not yet the master of the world, but awake, alive and dreaming of what it could be. The Republic was fragile, yes, but it was also eternal, for it lived not in marble or in crowns, but in the hearts of its people. And as long as they remembered that they were citizens, that the city was theirs, Rome would endure. The Republic had awakened, and with its awakening came a new rhythm of life. Yet, far beyond the Tiber's banks, far beyond the hills of Latium and the farms of the Roman countryside, another world was stirring. Across the sea, on the northern edge of Africa, stood a city that gleamed in the sunlight, rich with purple dye, with sails that stretched like wings upon the water, and merchants who weighed their gold on shining scales. That city was Carthage. It is in this soft telling that we do not hurry into battles, nor leap straight to noise. Instead, let us drift slowly, first into the sense of two great powers awakening, like two giants on different shores, unaware yet of how deeply their shadows would fall across one another. Rome still young but ambitious, its hands calloused from farming and its heart restless with the pride of citizens. Carthage older, wealthier, its ships threading the seas, its markets brimming with spices, ivory and silks that carried the scents of faraway lands. For many years they watched one another only from afar. Rome busy with Italy, extending its reach across hills and valleys, making alliances with towns and tribes, laying the foundations of its quiet strength. Carthage, gazing out upon the waves, stretching its hand into Spain, into Sicily, into the endless waters where silver flowed like rivers. Neither thought in those first days that their stories would soon be woven into one long and heavy tapestry. Yet history, even when told softly, bends toward meeting places. And so, the day would come when Rome and Carthage could no longer stand apart. In the soft light of early morning, imagine the Roman Forum. Citizens are gathered, murmuring about Sicily, that island set like a jewel in the heart of the sea. Sicily, with its fertile fields, its grain and olives, its harbours where ships from Greece, Africa, and the East would anchor. Sicily was too important, too near, too tempting to remain only as a prize for merchants. Whoever held Sicily held the key to the sea itself. And so, slowly, gently at first, Rome's attention shifted outward. No longer only hills and valleys, no longer only Italy. So now their eyes fell across the water. They did not yet know the storms awaiting them, only that the horizon seemed wider, richer, full of promise. Carthage, too, looked upon Sicily. For Carthage, the island was not promise but necessity. Its ships anchored there, its merchants thrived there, its children knew the taste of Sicilian grain. To Carthage, Sicily was not a prize to be won, but a lifeline already held. Thus began the shadows. Not with sword against sword, but with glances across the waves, with whispers in the markets, with treaties signed and broken. Slowly the air thickened with tension, though in our telling the tension is not sharp. It drifts like a low cloud, heavy but calm, carrying with it the weight of inevitability. Daily life, meanwhile, continued in both cities. In Rome, farmers still tilled the land. Women still spun wool by the hearth. Children still traced letters on wax tablets, their voices rising in chants of learning. Priests still sacrificed at dawn, their smoke rising softly into the sky. To the ordinary Roman, the talk of Sicily was distant like the sound of thunder on the horizon. In Carthage too, life unfolded. Merchants in purple cloaks weighed gold coins. Sailors carried amphorae of wine, jars of olives, bars of silver. The scent of incense drifted through the temples of Baal and Tanit, where solemn chants echoed beneath columns carved with signs of stars and moons. Children in the harbour played beside ships, tracing their fingers along ropes thick with tar, unaware that these same ropes would one day tie sails for war. Two worlds, different yet alike in their rhythms of daily life. Two cities, each alive in its own way, yet destined to clash. The First Punic War, as later it would be called, did not fall suddenly. It crept slowly like a tide. Rome, with no fleet of its own, gazed upon the sea with uncertainty. The Romans were farmers, soldiers, builders of roads, but sailors, not yet. Carthage was mistress of the waves, its ships swift and certain, its sailors bred to the sea as Romans were to the plough. But Rome, stubborn and patient, learned. The first ships they built were clumsy, copied hastily from captured Carthaginian designs. The waves rolled beneath them in ways strange to Roman feet, and many a man grew ill at the endless sway of the sea. Yet Rome, in its dreamlike persistence, invented something new, the corvus, the boarding bridge. With it, the Romans turned sea battles into land battles, where their soldiers' discipline could prevail, and so the war dragged on. 20 years of it, like a storm that never lifted, like a shadow stretching endlessly across the land and sea. Battles were fought, ships sunk, soldiers marched, Sicily ravaged. But still, the war lingered, heavy and endless. Yet even here, in our soft retelling, there is no rush. Think of the soldiers not as names in a book, but as men lying awake at night beneath strange Sicilian stars, longing for their farms back in Latium. Think of the Carthaginian sailors staring at the waves that had once been their home, now choked with fire and wreckage. Think of the mothers in both cities waiting, always waiting, for sons who would not return. War is often told with noise, but here it is told with silence, with the spaces between, with the quiet endurance of ordinary lives. At last, after so many years, Rome prevailed. The seas were not fully theirs, not yet, but Sicily was taken, claimed as Rome's first province beyond Italy. Carthage, wounded but not destroyed, returned to Africa, its pride dimmed but not extinguished, and in this moment, as Rome looked upon Sicily, the city seemed to stand taller. The Republic was no longer only of the hills and the river, no longer only of Latium, it had crossed the sea. Its shadow, too, now stretched outward. But in shadows there are always deeper shadows, for Carthage, though defeated, still breathed. Its heart still beat with wealth, its harbours still filled with sails, its generals still dreamed of glory. And among them, in time, would rise a man named Hannibal. His story waits like a storm beyond the horizon, not yet told, but certain to come. And so the chapter closes softly here, not with a crash, but with a hush. Rome victorious, Carthage wounded, and the sea lying still beneath the sun. Yet the quiet is only a pause, a held breath, before the next storm begins. The war, though heavy, was not the whole of life. Far from the front lines, the city of Rome still breathed in its ordinary rhythm, like a heart that refused to cease its beating. In the forum, merchants continued to cry their wares, figs sweet as honey, bread still warm from the oven, clay lamps that flickered like captured stars. Children darted through the colonnades, chasing one another, their laughter a bright thread woven into the fabric of a weary republic. On the edges of the city, farmers bent low over their fields, their sandals pressing into the soil that had nourished them for generations. They ploughed, they sowed, they prayed to the gods for rain. Some fields lay untended, their owners gone to Sicily, but neighbours shared labour, for the land was sacred and could not be left to wither. Women with steady hands wove cloth in shaded courtyards. Their songs rose in the air, soft practical tunes, the kind that kept rhythm as the spindle turned, yet each note held the ache of absence. The temples of Rome filled with offerings. At the altar of Jupiter, priests sprinkled salt and flour over the flames. At the shrine of Vesta, virgins tended the eternal fire, their faces calm in the glow. In the temple of Mars, prayers for victory mingled with the smoke of sacrifice. Ordinary Romans, rich and poor alike, brought doves, grain or coins, whispering petitions for sons at sea, for brothers in Sicily, for the Republic itself. Religion was not a separate act, but a thread that bound every hour of life. Even as war pressed heavily on the Republic, the people trusted that the gods were listening. Across the sea, Carthage too carried on. The harbours rang with the sound of hammers, the creak of ropes, the slap of waves against dark hulls. Sailors smeared pitch upon planks, the smell of tar sharp in the air. Children skipped along the piers, balancing carefully on beams of wood, their bare feet tapping like drums. In the bustling markets the colours dazzled. Purple cloth from Tyre, spices from Arabia, silver from Iberia, ivory from Africa. Women bartered in voices quick and sure, their eyes sharp as they weighed figs and olives with practised care. Carthaginian life was bound to the sea. At dawn, fishermen rowed out, their nets dropping into waters still cool with night. At dusk, they returned, their boats low with catch, the smell of salt and fish clinging to their skin. Families gathered to meet them, children scrambling down to the sand, eager to taste the day's first gift from the sea. The city's temples, too, breathed with prayer. Incense curled in the shrines of Bulhaman and Tanit, while sacred chants filled the air with echoes both solemn and soothing. The people prayed for fortune, for the safety of their ships, for victory against the rising Roman shadow. But war cast ripples into these rhythms. In Rome, the absence of men stretched across the city like a quiet emptiness. Old fathers tilled the land alone. Young wives raised children who barely remembered the faces of their fathers. Letters scratched on thin wax tablets travelled across the sea, carrying words of longing, of courage, of homesickness. Many never reached their destination, lost to storms or war, but the act of writing was itself a thread of hope. In Carthage, too, absences deepened. Ships left the harbour filled with young sailors who did not return. The markets grew quieter, for fewer goods arrived when the seas grew dangerous. Mothers lit lamps in windows, a silent prayer that their sons might see the glow again. And still, the rituals continued. Festivals were held, songs were sung, children played in the sun. Life insisted on itself, even as shadows lengthened. Rome's creation of a fleet changed daily life as well. Imagine a young farmer who had never before seen the open sea, stepping into the hollow belly of a ship for the first time. The wood groaned beneath his sandals, the salt wind stung his eyes. His hands, skilled in holding a plough, now gripped an oar. The sea rocked him, and his stomach churned with both fear and determination. All around him, men like him learned the strange new rhythm of rowing, the beat of drums, the cry of commanders, the endless dip and lift of oars that caught the sunlight like silver. The invention of the corvus, that wooden bridge with its iron spike, was more than a tool of war. It was a symbol of Rome's stubborn heart. The Romans did not surrender to the sea. They turned it, in their minds, into another kind of battlefield, one they could walk upon as if it were earth. And so, in every Roman home the story spread that no matter how strange the world, no matter how vast the horizon, Rome could learn, Rome could adapt, Rome could endure. As the years dragged on, the war felt endless. A generation grew up knowing nothing but stories of battles in Sicily and storms at sea. Yet, woven into the endless march of time were festivals, feasts, and small joys. In Rome, children still ran in circles at the festival of Saturnalia, their laughter echoing beneath garlands of ivy. In Carthage, people still gathered for the festival of Tanit, carrying flowers to the temple, their voices raised in song as the sun sank red into the sea. Ordinary joys, bread fresh from the oven, a jug of cool water on a hot day, the hush of night when cicadas sang, these kept the people steady. The Republic and the great city of Carthage were more than war machines. They were living places, filled with hearts that longed for peace even while leaders plotted strategy. At last, when Sicily fell fully into Rome's hands, a hush settled. The war had ended, though scars remained. In Rome, bells rang, sacrifices were made, and people filled the streets with cautious celebration. In Carthage, silence hung heavy, for the defeat was bitter, and yet both cities returned again to their rhythms. Markets reopened, fields were tended, children played, but the shadows lingered. Both cities knew that this was not the end. The war had been a beginning, the first of storms. Somewhere, in the quiet halls of Carthage, a boy named Hannibal was growing, his mind filled with stories of Rome. his heart burning with a vow whispered before the gods. Rome, though victorious, felt the weight of its own ambition, for Sicily was only the first step outward into a wider world. The sea lay between them still, calm on its surface, yet beneath it, currents churned, unseen but certain. Rome and Carthage, like two vast shadows, could not help but grow toward one another again. And so, the chapter closes not with a cry of victory, but with the murmur of waves. Rome's shadow stretched across Sicily. Carthage, wounded yet alive, watched from across the water. The people of both cities returned to their daily lives, planting, weaving, praying, dreaming, never knowing that the greatest storm was still to come. The air of the mountains was sharp, carrying a cold that bit into bone. Snow drifted in pale silence, covering rock and pine alike, as though the gods themselves had laid a white shroud across the world. Into that world came Hannibal, leading his army not along gentle roads, but into the heart of the Alps, where men, beasts, and dreams alike were tested. It was a sight that later generations would tell in whispers. Elephants walking among the snow, their massive shapes wrapped in frost, their eyes dark with both patience and confusion. Soldiers trudged at their side, their cloaks stiff with ice, their sandals worn thin, their breath rising in clouds. The mountains seemed endless, a realm of silence and stone, and yet onward they moved. For Hannibal had sworn an oath. As a boy in Carthage, before the altar of the gods, he had vowed eternal enmity against Rome. That vow burned in him still, warmer than any fire, stronger than any storm. He would not let mountains stop him. He would bring the war into Italy itself, into the very heart of Rome. But war is not only the tale of generals and vows, it is also the tale of ordinary men who followed. Farmers from Spain, warriors from Africa, tribesmen from Gaul, all had left behind homes filled with quiet life. Some had left children who waved from doorways. Some had left wives who waited by empty hearths. Now, in the silence of snow, they remembered the warmth of those hearths, the taste of bread, the sound of laughter. The mountains, cold and endless, made those memories sharper, like stars glittering against the blackness of night. Nights in the Alps were long. Soldiers huddled around small fires, their cloaks pulled tight, their teeth chattering. They melted snow in bronze pots for water, roasted what little meat they had, and passed it hand to hand to hand. Stories were told, stories of Carthage's harbours, of Spain's vineyards, of villages where the sun was warm and the fields green. In those stories, for a brief time, the soldiers were home again. The elephants, too, were tended carefully. Their handlers brushed snow from their hides, wrapped them in cloth when possible, and coaxed them forward with soft voices and offerings of grain. The animals' great strength gave the men courage. If the elephants could endure, so could they. The mountains did not yield easily. Rocks fell from cliffs, sending echoes through the valleys. Narrow paths crumbled beneath weary feet. Men slipped, some lost forever to the abyss below. Yet still the army pressed forward. When they reached sheer walls of stone, they carved steps into the rock. When ice blocked their path, they lit fires to crack it. The mountains were no longer an obstacle, they became a battlefield, and every step forward was a victory. Meanwhile, in Rome, whispers spread like wind through the forum. News came that Hannibal had crossed the Ebro, then the Rhone. Now, the rumour said, he was crossing the Alps themselves. At first, many laughed. And no army can bring elephants across mountains, some declared. But others felt unease, for Rome knew the tenacity of its foe. Mothers drew their children close. Old men recalled tales of the First Punic War. In the temples, prayers rose more urgently, as though the gods themselves might be persuaded to hold back the shadow moving toward Italy. In the city, daily life continued, though beneath it ran a current of fear. Bakers rose before dawn, kneading dough by lantern light, though their minds strayed toward the rumours. Farmers brought their produce to market, their wagons creaking, yet they spoke in hushed tones of Carthage's advance. Children still played in the streets, chasing hoops and balls, yet their laughter carried a nervous edge, for even they sensed the unease of their elders. Rome prepared, soldiers were mustered, weapons checked, roads patrolled. Yet still the image haunted them, a Carthaginian host, climbing down from the clouds themselves, carrying war upon their backs. High in the Alps, Hannibal's army at last reached the summit. There, beneath the sky as pale as glass, Hannibal gathered his men. He pointed southward, where the haze of the Italian plains stretched faintly in the distance. There, he told them, his voice carrying through the thin air, is Rome. Haner. There lies the prize we have suffered for. Beyond these mountains are fields rich with grain, rivers broad and clear, villages and cities that do not yet know the fear of us. Soon they shall. The men cheered, though their voices were hoarse. The elephants trumpeted, their cries echoing like horns through the valleys. In that moment their suffering felt worth it, for they had touched the impossible and survived. The descent was no easier. Avalanches roared. Rivers of ice split beneath their feet. Yet step by step, day by day, they came down from the mountains, and when at last they reached the green plains of Italy, the soldiers wept with relief. They touched the grass as though it were gold, drank deeply from clear streams, and gave thanks to the gods. Behind them lay the mountains, silent, eternal witnesses to their endurance. Ahead lay Rome, unknowing still of how close the shadow had come. In Carthage, news of Hannibal's crossing spread like fire. Merchants in the harbour whispered it to sailors, mothers to children, priests to worshippers. The city glowed with pride, for never before had such a feat been attempted. Yet beneath the pride lay a quiet fear as well, for war carried risk, and Hannibal now walked far from Carthage's shores, his fate tied to lands across the sea. In Rome, fear sharpened. Scouts brought word. Hannibal was in Italy. The unimaginable had become real. Farmers in the north abandoned fields, villagers fled, soldiers marched with heavy urgency, and in the forum senators gathered, their robes heavy, their faces grave. The Punic shadow had entered their land. The war was no longer distant. It was at their door. Yet even as the clash of great powers loomed, life continued. In villages near the Alps, shepherds still tended their flocks. Children picked flowers in meadows, their laughter mingling with the wind. Priests still lit fires at shrines. The world moved on in its eternal rhythm, even as history's storm gathered. And so the chapter closes, with Hannibal standing upon the plains of Italy, his vow unbroken, his army weary yet alive. The mountains lay behind him, the dream of Rome before him. For the people of Rome, dread whispered like a chill in the air. For the people of Carthage, pride burned like a steady flame. The Alps, indifferent and eternal, kept their silence, knowing they had witnessed something that would be told for ages. The shadow had crossed into Italy. The story was only beginning. The march through the Alps was not only the story of armies and elephants, it was also the story of countless little moments, half forgotten by the world, but vivid for those who lived them. The mountains tested not only Hannibal's will, but the very endurance of ordinary life carried into extraordinary places. At dawn, when the snow still glowed faintly blue under the rising sun, men rose stiffly from their cloaks. Their joints ached, their breath clouded in the air, but still they moved, for the march had to go on. A soldier from Numidia stretched his arms wide and muttered a prayer to the sun, for warmth was more precious than gold. A Spaniard, his beard rimmed with frost, tied a leather strap more tightly around his worn sandal, hoping it would last the day. Beside them, a young Gaul whispered to his comrade of home, of the river where he used to fish as a boy, of the orchard where his mother gathered apples, of the laughter of his little sister. Even in the army's suffering, memory softened the pain. The elephants stirred too, stamping their feet, their trunks reaching for bundles of forage. Their handlers spoke to them gently, offering words as soothing as the touch of hands. When the elephants trumpeted, the sound rolled down the valleys, as though some ancient god had woken and given voice to the mountains. As they climbed, silence pressed heavily. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, no leaves rustled, for the world was stone and snow. Yet the army filled that silence with its own sounds. The crunch of boots, the ring of picks on rock, the creak of leather straps, the occasional cry when a man slipped. Some fell, swallowed by the abyss. Others were buried in sudden slides of snow. The survivors pressed forward, their eyes fixed not on the heights above, but on the footsteps just before them. Each step was a victory, each hour survived a gift. At night, fires flickered weakly, shadows long upon the snow. Men sat close, hands stretched out, faces red with cold and flame. They roasted what they could, scraps of meat, roots found beneath the snow, dried grain from dwindling stores. Sometimes a soldier shared a song from his homeland, the notes carrying softly in the night air. A Spaniard sang of vineyards under the sun. A Numidian hummed of deserts where stars burned bright. Others listened, eyes closed, letting the music carry them far from the mountains. And yet the march was not only hardship. There were moments when the mountains revealed strange beauty. Dawn painted the snow in rose and gold. Streams of ice melted into rivulets that glittered in sunlight. At night, the sky stretched vast and black, filled with countless stars, so many that the men whispered of omens. Some said the gods were watching. Others said the spirits of the dead marched alongside them. Phew. Hannibal himself remained steady. Wrapped in a cloak, his eyes sharp, he spoke little, but his presence steadied his men. He was the flame that would not die, the vow that carried them all forward. When morale faltered, he reminded them, Italy lies beyond, Rome lies beyond, Rome lies beyond. Each step is one step closer. And they believed, far to the south, Rome itself stirred with unease. In the markets of the city, merchants spread their wares, baskets of olives, jars of honey, bolts of cloth, but their voices carried whispers as often as bargains. They say Hannibal has crossed the Rhone, one murmured. They say he has elephants. Another scoffed, but his eyes betrayed worry. Elephants? Across the mountains? No creature survives such cold, yet others were not so sure. Fear wove itself through the stalls more subtly than the scent of bread or spice. Children played in the streets, chasing hoops and tossing knucklebones, but their games echoed with fragments of overheard talk. One boy declared himself Hannibal, leading his friends across an imaginary mountain. Another, pretending to be a Roman consul, stood firm and promised to defend the city. Their laughter was bright, but their parents, watching from doorways, did not laugh. In the temples, priests burned incense more heavily, lifting prayers to Jupiter, to Mars, to every god who might shield Rome from this coming storm. Women knelt with offerings of fruit, wine, or flowers, their heads bowed, the smoke rose in curls, carrying both hope and fear. Meanwhile, in villages closer to the Alps, daily life began to feel the first breath of shadow. Farmers tilling frozen fields paused to see strange shapes moving along distant ridges. Tiny at first, then clearer, until even at such distance they could see elephants, immense against the white. Children clutched their mothers' cloaks, shepherds herded flocks more quickly, into pens. Travellers hurried along roads with anxious eyes. Some fled, abandoning cottages and tools. Others stayed, hoping the tide of war might pass them by. But all felt the weight of something vast and unstoppable pressing closer with each passing day. Back in Hannibal's camp, the descent from the Alps began. The path downward was as perilous as the climb up. Ice cracked beneath feet, avalanches thundered, and rivers of snow threatened to sweep all away. Yet step by step they moved downward until one morning the world changed. The snow gave way to grass, the cold air softened, streams ran freely, birds returned, trees swayed gently, soldiers fell to their knees and touched the earth, kissing it, weeping for relief. Some plucked handfuls of green grass and tucked them into their belts, as though to carry proof that life still existed. The elephants, too, rumbled with contentment, splashing in streams and trumpeting at the smell of greenery. For a moment the army was not weary men but children again, marvelling at simple things. The warmth of the sun, the sweetness of water, the colour of leaves. From there, the first villages of Italy appeared. The people of those villages looked up in astonishment and fear as the Carthaginian host descended upon their land. They had never seen elephants before. To them, these beasts seemed like gods or monsters, vast shapes of muscle and tusk, their footsteps shaking the earth. Children cried out, some hiding behind walls, others peering wide-eyed from doorways. Farmers abandoned their ploughs midfield, oxen left tethered. The Carthaginians did not yet bring destruction. They marched, they rested, they moved on. But the shadow was enough. Word spread swiftly. Hannibal was in Italy. The impossible had happened. Rome listened. Senators gathered in the forum, their robes heavy, their faces pale. Voices clashed, some demanding immediate armies, others urging caution, some warning that fear itself could weaken Rome. Yet all agreed on one thing. Hannibal was no longer a distant threat. He was here, on their soil. In homes across the city, families sat close by hearths, speaking quietly. Mothers held children tighter. Fathers sharpened tools that might soon serve as weapons. Young men, hearing the call of duty, prepared to join the legions. The city, still alive with its usual rhythms, bakers baking, smiths hammering, children laughing, now beat with a new pulse, faster, heavier shadowed. And so Hannibal stood upon Italian ground. Behind him lay the Alps, indifferent, eternal. Before him stretched a land rich and green, dotted with villages, fields, rivers and roads that all led in the end, to Rome. For the Carthaginians, hope burned bright, for they had achieved the impossible. For the Romans, dread lingered like a low wind, for the storm had crossed their threshold. The march of Hannibal was more than a feat of war. It was a story of men against mountains, of elephants against snow, of memory and endurance, of ordinary life caught in extraordinary times. It was only the beginning. The first great clash came with the river Trebia, Winter lay heavy on the land, cold mist curling above fields, the river swollen and cruel with icy waters. Yet still, life in the surrounding countryside tried to go on, even as armies gathered. Farmers rose at dawn to tend goats and cattle, though their eyes strayed often to the horizon, where columns of soldiers stretched like restless shadows. Children helped sweep frost from doorsteps and carried baskets of kindling for their mothers, but their laughter was quieter, as though the air itself demanded silence. Markets opened with jars of olives, figs, and bread, but the voices of merchants faltered whenever riders thundered past. Full. Rome and Carthage were about to write their struggle upon the land, and everyone could feel it. Hannibal had brought his weary men through the Alps, and now they looked upon the plains of Italy with new hunger. Here was warmth, here was food, here was the chance to fight Rome upon her own ground. His cavalry, swift Numidians with dark eyes and light spears, trotted across the fields like hawks circling above prey. His elephants, though fewer now, lumbered beside him, their trunks swinging gently, their ears fanning the chill air. Across the river, the Roman army gathered. Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, prepared to strike. His men, hardened by years of discipline, stood in ranks, shields shining with cold light, their breath rising like smoke. But they had been called to battle from their warm camp, their bellies heavy with breakfast, their armour hastily buckled. The river lay between them and Hannibal, and the Carthaginian general knew well how cruel a river could be. At dawn, Hannibal sent his cavalry forward, taunting, striking, drawing the Romans out. Longus ordered pursuit. The legions splashed into the Trebia, the icy water biting at their legs, their armour dragging them down. Teeth chattered, limbs numbed, yet still they forced across, for honour and Rome drove them. But when they reached the far bank, the trap closed. From the reeds and willows, hidden soldiers burst forth, men Hannibal had concealed overnight, crouched in the frost. They struck like wolves, tearing at the Roman flanks. Cavalry swept in from the sides, elephants charged, and from the front the main Carthaginian force pressed hard. The Roman lines buckled beneath weight and surprise. Shields splintered, men cried out, horses screamed. The river behind them ran red, the fields became mud of blood and frost. And yet, in the midst of chaos, daily life clung faintly on. In nearby cottages, families huddled close, listening to the distant thunder. Mothers pressed hands over children's ears when the wind carried the sound of horns and cries. Shepherds drove their flocks farther into the hills, hoping the gods would turn battle away from their pastures. Traders, trapped upon roads between the two armies, hid their wagons in groves and whispered prayers to Mercury, god of travellers. By evening, Hannibal stood victorious. The Romans had been driven back, bloodied and broken, their pride shaken. The fields of Trebia lay littered with armour, with broken standards, with the silence of the fallen. Fires crackled as soldiers searched for the wounded. Elephants trumpeted, stamping the frozen earth. The river, cold and tireless, carried away men who had slipped beneath its waves. But the war was not finished. It was only deepening, spreading like a shadow across the land. Months passed, winter softened, then spring, then summer, and with it Hannibal moved southward, his army threading the valleys and ridges of Italy. Villages saw them pass, strange foreigners with dark skin, bright garments, and monstrous beasts that no Italian child had ever seen before. Some fled, some offered food and drink, hoping to appease. Others watched in silence, their hearts torn between fear and awe. Rome, wounded but unbroken, gathered new legions. The Senate declared fresh musters, farmers leaving their fields, young men their families, blacksmiths their forges. The city pulsed with determination. Children played at soldiers in the forum, chanting Hannibal's name like a ghost to be vanquished. Women lit lamps in temples, praying to Juno, to Jupiter, to Mars, that their husbands and sons might return. The consuls of Rome prepared once more to meet Hannibal. The next clash came by the waters of Lake Trasimene, a place of soft hills, olive groves, and quiet villages. Normally, fishermen cast their nets there, and children played along the shore, chasing each other among the reeds. But in that year, the lake was to see horror unlike any before. Hannibal studied the land and found it perfect for his design. He set his camp openly by the shore, luring the Romans on. In the hills and forests he concealed his best soldiers, crouched low, silent as stones, waiting. The mist that often rolled from the lake at dawn would hide them well. The Romans, under Consul Gaius Flaminius, marched eagerly. Flaminius, proud and impatient, longed for victory. His men followed with steady discipline, the creak of wagons and the beat of sandals marking their advance. But they marched into a trap woven not only of men but of land itself. At dawn, as the mist curled thick across the fields, the Romans pressed along the narrow path between lake and hills. Waters lapped softly at their side, while above, unseen, Hannibal's army lay hidden. Shepherds in distant fields paused with their flocks, hearing the muffled tramp of thousands, but seeing little through the veil of mist. Fishermen upon the lake pulled in their nets, their eyes wide as the fog seemed to hum with unseen movement. Then, as the last of the Romans entered the pass, Hannibal gave the signal. The hills erupted with war cries. From the slopes, soldiers poured down like rivers of bronze and steel. Spears rained, cavalry charged, elephants bellowed. The mist became chaos, a storm of shadow and sound. The Romans, caught between water and hillside, had nowhere to flee. They fought bravely, shields raised, voices calling to one another, but confusion reigned. Commanders could not see their men could not see their commanders. Lines broke, fear spread, and the lake itself drank deep of their despair. Some tried to swim, casting off armour, plunging into the cold waters. Fishermen, helpless, turned their boats away, hearing the splash of drowning men. Others fell where they stood, their swords clenched tight even in death. Flaminius himself perished in the press, his pride swallowed by the very trap he had marched into. By midday it was finished. The Roman army lay shattered, scattered upon hillsides and lake shores. Silence after was heavy, broken only by the cries of wounded and the lap of water against reeds. The fishermen, returning later, found nets tangled with armour, with shields, with fragments of a battle too vast for them to comprehend. Yet beyond the slaughter, life still clung. In villages near the lake, children whispered of the mist, calling it haunted. Farmers who once tilled peacefully now walked fields scarred by spears. In temples, offerings doubled, incense rising in thick clouds as priests pleaded for Rome's deliverance. Sailors upon the Tiber, carrying grain and wine, spoke in low voices of the defeat, wondering if Hannibal would soon march upon the city itself. Rome mourned, but Rome did not surrender. Senators stood grim in the forum, vowing that the Republic would rise again, that no storm, however fierce, would break her spirit. Families lit lamps at dusk, keeping vigil for the lost. The hum of markets, the ringing of hammers, the laughter of children, all continued, though softened, as though the city itself held its breath. And in Hannibal's camp, fires glowed bright. Soldiers feasted, their confidence swelling, for they had struck Rome again, and each time the Republic had bled. Elephants swayed in contentment, horses stamped, and men told stories of the misty lake, of how the gods themselves must have cloaked their ambush. But even Hannibal, in the quiet of his tent, must have known that victory was not yet triumph. Rome still stood, unbroken, its heart fierce, its will eternal. The shadow deepened, but the fire of the Republic burned on. There are moments in history when time seems to pause, when the sun rises as it always has, yet the day beneath it unfolds like no other. For Rome, such a day was canny, a name whispered with dread, a memory carried for centuries like a scar upon the soul of the Republic. Yet even such a day, in this soft telling, must begin gently. Imagine the early morning air across the plains of Apulia. The land stretches wide and flat, fields of golden grain swaying in a quiet breeze. Farmers rise with the dawn, as they always do, carrying water to their oxen, calling softly to their children. The sun lifts slowly, warm and innocent, touching the earth with a glow that seems to promise peace. But peace, though wished for, will not live here long. On one side of the plain, the Romans gather, an army vast and proud, perhaps the largest they had ever assembled. Nearly 80,000 men, their shields polished, their helmets gleaming, their standards fluttering like proud birds in the wind. They had come not just to fight Hannibal, but to crush him, to rid the Republic of his shadow once and for all. Their spirits, though heavy with fear, were lifted by sheer numbers. Rome, they believed, could not be defeated when so many stood together. On the other side, Hannibal waited. His army was smaller, leaner, its strength lying not in numbers but in the cunning arrangement of its parts. Spaniards with their curved blades, Gauls with their wild cries, Africans with their steady spears, cavalry that rode with the swiftness of the wind. They were fewer, but they were patient, disciplined, and above all, guided by Hannibal's mind, which saw the plain not as it was, but as it might be shaped. And so the day began softly, with dew on the grass and breath in the air, with farmers unaware that their fields would soon drink not water but blood. In Rome, far away, the city stirred. Mothers swept the thresholds of their houses, Priests lit fires at dawn, children ran barefoot in the alleys. News of the coming battle had filled the air for weeks, yet few truly understood what it meant. Life went on as it always did, for Rome was vast, and battles were far away. The forum bustled, merchants unrolled bolts of cloth, bakers kneaded dough, and senators debated beneath the shadow of the Curia. Rome was alive, unaware that its sons on the plain of Cannae were stepping into a storm, unlike any it had ever known. Hannibal placed his men carefully. At the centre, he arranged his Gauls and Spaniards in a line that bowed gently outward, like a crescent. Behind them, hidden in reserve, the Africans stood steady, their spears gleaming. On the wings, his cavalry waited, restless as horses before the hunt. Hannibal himself rode slowly along the line, speaking softly to his men, reminding them not of death but of the life that would follow, of the farms they would return to, the children they would embrace. He told them that today the gods had given them a chance not just to fight, but to endure, to live through victory. The Romans, confident in their numbers, pressed forward. Their infantry massed deep, their shields locking, their standards lifted high. They sought to smash Hannibal's centre, to grind through his line by sheer weight. Dust rose around their feet, the air thickening with the sound of marching, with the steady beat of thousands of sandals striking the earth. At first, it seemed the Romans would succeed. The crescent of Hannibal's line bent backward, step by step, folding slowly inward. The Gauls gritted their teeth. The Spaniards fought desperately, the centre giving ground under the crushing weight of Rome's army. From a distance, it looked as though Hannibal was being driven back, as though his army might collapse. But this was the shape Hannibal had drawn in his mind long before the battle began. Slowly, as the Roman army pressed deeper, its flanks grew exposed. The crescent bent inward until the Romans found themselves surrounded not by emptiness, but by walls of men. On the wings, Hannibal's cavalry swept around, fierce and relentless, striking the Roman horse and driving it from the field. Then, turning swiftly, they fell upon the rear of the Roman infantry, sealing them in like a door closing upon a chamber, and so the trap was sprung. The vast Roman army, proud and numerous, found itself hemmed on every side. What had begun as an advance became a prison. The press of bodies grew suffocating, shields locked too tightly to move, men unable even to raise their arms to strike. The dust thickened, the cries rose, the air became heavy with fear. The soldiers at the back did not even see the enemy. They felt only the crush of their own comrades, the terror passing like a wave from front to rear. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. Yet even here told in softness, we linger not on the gore, but on the silence between cries, the weight of despair, the hush that fell over the plain as the sun climbed higher. Imagine a Roman soldier, pressed in the centre, unable to move, his thoughts drifting not to the enemy before him, but to the vineyard he had left behind, to the laughter of his children. Imagine a Carthaginian spearman, weary from hours of fighting, thinking not of glory but of the cool water he might drink when the day was done. Cannae was not only the clash of two armies, it was the stillness of countless hearts pausing in the face of fate. By the day's end, tens of thousands of Romans lay upon the field. Senators, consuls, citizens, names great and small alike, were carried into death. Never before had the Republic suffered such a wound. The plain of Cannae became a sea of silence, broken only by the buzz of flies, the distant calls of crows circling above. Far away in Rome, the news arrived not with shouts, but with whispers. Messengers entered the city pale and silent, their voices trembling as they spoke. Mothers felt their hearts collapse before the words were finished. Wives tore their garments, fathers covered their faces with ash. The forum fell still. Never had Rome felt so fragile, never had its people feared so deeply that the end might be near. Yet in that silence, a strange strength began to stir. Rome did not collapse, though its heart was broken. The Senate, shaken but unyielding, decreed that the city would endure, that no peace would be made with Hannibal, no surrender offered. Children were gathered, families drawn closer, the city itself bracing like a ship battered by waves but refusing to sink. Cannae was darkness, yet from that darkness would grow a new and terrible resolve. And so this chapter closes softly on the hush of that field. The sun setting slowly over Apulia, its light falling across the silent plain, across the broken standards, across the weary survivors. Cannae would be remembered not only as Rome's greatest defeat, but as the day when the Republic, wounded but not destroyed, learned the depth of its own endurance. The night that followed was heavy, filled with mourning, but also with a strange, quiet flame, the knowledge that even in the darkest shadow, Rome would not bow. There are days in history when the world seems to tremble beneath invisible weight. The sun rises as always, the birds stir in their hedges, the earth exhales mist in the morning air, but something deeper moves beneath the surface, like the breath of destiny itself. For Rome that day was canny. It began with light, soft and golden, spilling across the plain of Apulia. The land was wide and open, a sea of grass bending beneath the summer wind. Farmers had sown barley and wheat here in spring, and now the fields stood tall, stalks rippling like waves upon a golden sea. A few peasants walked the edges of their farms that morning, pulling cloaks tighter against the cool dawn, unaware that by evening their soil would be soaked in blood, their crops trampled, their fields forever changed. A shepherd drove his flock toward the river, humming an old tune his father had once sung. A boy followed, barefoot in the dew, carrying a crooked stick to guide the sheep. They did not know that armies stood nearby waiting. To them, the day was just another in the rhythm of life, sunrise, grazing, water, rest. But destiny was already unfolding beside them. On one side of the plain, the Roman army prepared itself. Nearly 80,000 men stood together, the largest force Rome had ever sent into battle. Their shields gleamed like a wall of bronze, their helmets shone beneath the rising sun, their red standards fluttered proudly in the wind. Some men stood tall with confidence, others whispered prayers, clutching amulets or tokens from home. Imagine one of them. Marcus, a farmer's son from Latium, who had left his vineyard to answer the Senate's call. He tied the leather strap of his sandal tightly that morning, not knowing whether he would untie it again. He thought of his wife who had kissed him goodbye at the doorway of their small house, her eyes both proud and fearful. He thought of his little daughter, who had pressed a flower into his hand as he marched away. He carried the dried blossom still, tucked against his chest beneath his armour. Beside him stood Lucius, a man from the bustling city of Rome, who had once sold grain in the Forum. He was no soldier by trade, but duty had called him too. As the legions formed ranks, he whispered to his neighbour that after the war he would return to his stall, spreading sacks of grain beneath the morning sun, listening to the chatter of housewives haggling for bread. He longed for ordinary days, for the hum of the marketplace, for the laughter of children darting between stalls. Each soldier carried such thoughts. Those stood silent, waiting for the trumpet's call. Beneath their armour, beneath their shields and spears, they were men longing for life, for home, for the small comforts of their daily existence. Across the plain, Hannibal prepared his army. His force was smaller, perhaps half the size of Rome's host, yet it carried with it the weight of cunning and experience. Gauls stood fierce and restless, their wild hair catching the sun. Spaniards sharpened their curved swords, speaking softly in their tongue. Africans stood tall with their long spears, disciplined and steady. And on the wings the cavalry waited, their horses stamping, breath steaming in the cool morning air. Hannibal rode slowly before them, calm and assured. His eyes were steady, his voice low but firm. He reminded his men of the journey they had already endured, the mountains crossed, the rivers forded, the battles won. He told them that Rome's pride was their weakness, that today they would not only fight, but reshape destiny. His words settled like warmth upon them, not a fiery call to rage, but a steady assurance that they were chosen for this moment. Among his army, too, were men with their own small lives waiting in memory. A Spanish soldier thought of the orange trees in his village, their blossoms filling the air with fragrance. A Gallic warrior remembered the laughter of his brother, with whom he had hunted wild boar in the forests of his homeland. An African spearman recalled the cool shade of palms beside the Nile, the voices of children playing in the sand. Each carried his homeland within, like a flame to guide him through the storm to come. The battle began with sound. Trumpets cried out, deep and urgent, the signal rolling like thunder across the plain. Shields lifted, spears lowered, feet stamped the earth in rhythm. Dust rose, swirling in the morning sun. The Romans advanced, their infantry packed tightly, a wall of men pressing forward. Step by step, shield by shield, they drove into Hannibal's centre. At first, it seemed the tide was theirs. The crescent of Hannibal's line bowed backward, bending like a reed under pressure. The Gauls groaned, the Spaniards gritted their teeth, giving ground inch by inch. From the Roman perspective, victory seemed close. They felt the enemy yielding, and confidence swelled in their chests, but Hannibal's plan was unfolding like a net. The crescent bent further, drawing the Romans inward. their flanks stretched thin, their numbers pressed into a narrow space. And when they were deep enough, the wings of Hannibal's army closed. His cavalry swept around fierce and relentless, striking from behind. The Romans, once the hunters, found themselves the prey, surrounded on every side. What followed was not a battle but a cage closing. The press of bodies grew unbearable. Soldiers could not lift their arms to strike, so tightly were they packed together. Shields clashed, spears broke, men gasped for breath in the crush of their own ranks. The cries of the wounded rose like waves, blending into a single, endless roar. Dust thickened in the air, choking, blinding. Imagine Marcus, the farmer's son, standing in the press. He tried to lift his shield, but his arm was trapped against the man beside him. He thought of his vineyard, of the rows of grapes ripening in the sun, of his daughter's laughter as she chased butterflies between the vines. For a moment, the sounds of battle faded, and only those memories remained. Imagine Lucius, the grain seller, caught in the crush. He could see nothing but helmets and shields, feel nothing but the push of bodies all around him. He thought of the forum, of the smell of baking bread, of the chatter of buyers. He longed to hear those sounds again, to see the sun strike the marble temples, to feel the weight of a sack of grain in his arms. But the weight upon him now was different, the weight of men, of fate, of a battle turned against him. By day's end, the plain of Apulia was covered in silence. Silent. Tens of thousands of Romans lay upon the earth, the proudest army of the Republic undone in a single day. The dust had settled, the cries had faded, and only the wind moved among the still forms. The farmers' fields were trampled, the golden grain bent and broken beneath the weight of battle. The shepherd who had driven his flock at dawn returned in the evening to find silence where once the air had been filled with life. Far away in Rome, the news came like a shadow. Messengers entered the city pale and trembling, their voices halting as they spoke of the disaster. Mothers felt their hearts collapse before the words were finished, for they knew what had been lost. Wives tore their garments, fathers covered their faces in ash. Children asked questions their parents could not answer. The forum, once alive with noise, fell into a hush broken only by weeping. Yet in that hush, something stirred. Rome did not surrender. The Senate, though shaken, refused to bend. People, though broken, refused to yield. They gathered their children close. They lit their lamps in the evening, they whispered prayers to their gods. Out of despair came a strange strength, the knowledge that Rome, though wounded, would endure. Night fell upon the field of Cannae. The moon rose, pale and cold, casting its light across the plain. The silence was deep, broken only by the rustle of wind through the trampled grass, by the distant cry of an owl, by the soft footsteps of those searching for survivors among the fallen. Hannibal's men moved quietly, weary and heavy-hearted, for even in victory they felt the weight of what had been done. Imagine that night, the stars above, indifferent and eternal, shining down upon the earth below. Among the fallen lay Marcus, the farmer's son, his hand still curled around the dried blossom his daughter had given him. Beside him lay Lucius, the grain seller, his face turned toward the sky, as though still listening for the hum of the forum. Their lives, like thousands of others, had become part of the silence, woven into the memory of Rome forever. And in the city itself, children slept uneasily, hearing the muffled sobs of their mothers, feeling the heaviness in the air. Priests tended the fires in the temples, whispering prayers into the night. The Tiber flowed on, dark and steady, carrying the reflection of the moon upon its surface. Rome endured the night, heavy with grief, yet still breathing. Cannae was darkness, but within that darkness a spark remained, a stubborn, quiet flame that would not die. For Rome, even in its greatest loss, refused to surrender, and that refusal, whispered into the silence of the night, would carry the Republic forward into the chapters yet to come. The battle had ended, yet the silence afterward seemed heavier than the clash of swords. Cannae was not merely a field where men had fought, it became a shadow stretched across the soul of Rome. The dust of Apulia still lay on the grass, mingled with blood, but already the earth was closing its wounds. Only the hearts of the Romans remained open, raw, trembling like strings that had been struck too hard. In Rome itself, the forum stood quiet. Merchants who once shouted out the worth of figs and olives now spoke in hushed tones. Mothers carried baskets not with joy but with worry, their eyes searching the sky as if for signs that their sons might return. The temples were filled with smoke, not of celebration but of desperate sacrifice. At dawn, old priests lit fires upon altars and prayed with trembling hands, whispering the names of gods who had heard prayers for centuries, yet who seemed so distant now. In the countryside, life carried on, though every task felt like an echo. Farmers bent low to cut wheat, yet their minds wandered towards sons who had not come home. The sheep moved softly across the hills, their bells carrying fragile music, but shepherds watched them with heavy eyes, knowing even the hills had heard of Hannibal. Children played in alleys of Rome, their games of wooden swords and tiny shields suddenly feeling too sharp, too real for mothers to bear. They called them in early, gathered them close, pressed kisses to their foreheads as if such tenderness could ward off fate. At the Tiber's edge, fishermen pulled in their nets, the silver of small fish glistening in the sun. Yet even here, the talk was of shadows. A man would point east, toward the land where battles raged, and shake his head slowly. Another would say, Rome has seen dark days before. Yet none truly believed their own words. Night came as a heavy veil. Over Apulia, where the battlefield lay still, the stars looked down without judgment. Soldiers who had survived lay upon the ground, not sleeping, but staring upward, wondering why they had been spared. Some whispered the names of brothers lost, others pressed their faces into the earth, breathing its scent, as if to remind themselves they were alive. In Rome, candles flickered in windows. Women sat beside empty chairs, waiting for footsteps that would never return. And yet, amid the grief, there was a strange endurance, quiet and almost invisible. Rome had been struck, yet Rome still breathed. The Senate met in dim chambers, the voices of old men rising slowly like the glow of embers. They spoke not of surrender, but of resilience. "We have lost battles before," one whispered, "but we are Rome. Rome does not end in a single day." Their words were fragile, yet in the silence of the city they carried weight. The ashes of hope were scattered across the land, but even ashes can hide sparks. A farmer, planting seeds though his heart was broken, believed perhaps in a harvest yet to come. A mother, whispering lullabies to a child, believed that Rome must endure, if not for herself, then for the little one in her arms. And in the heart of the eternal city, beneath grief and dread, there stirred the faint, slow beat of determination, like the soft rhythm of a drum far away. So the days after Cani drifted onward, sorrowful, quiet, dreamlike, the Republic lay wounded, yet not dead. The ashes of hope still glowed faintly, waiting for the breath of time to awaken them again. The sun rose slowly over Rome, its light pale, almost hesitant, as if the heavens themselves mourned what had happened in Apulia. The city stirred, yet not with its old vigour. Markets opened, but with half their usual noise. The Forum, once a place of constant chatter, was softened now to whispers, like the hushed tones of a family in mourning. Women walked carefully with baskets of figs, olives and bread, their sandals clicking softly upon the stone streets. Where once they might have greeted neighbours with cheerful words, now they gave only a nod, their eyes red from sleepless nights. Many of them had sons at Cani, many had husbands, and now many had none. In the narrow lanes of the Sabura district, children still played, for childhood does not know the weight of grief in the same way. They clattered wooden sticks against clay walls, imagining themselves heroes of some story, defenders of Rome. But their laughter carried strangely in the air, echoing against silence, and mothers often came quickly to hush them, pulling them back indoors as though the gods themselves might be offended by joy. At the Tiber's edge, fishermen untangled their nets. The morning mist rose in gentle curls above the river, the smell of wet reeds filling the air. One man pulled up his catch and sighed. "It is less today," he murmured. Another nodded. "The river feels it too." They did not need to say what Heights was. Everyone knew. Even the river seemed quieter, its waters sliding slowly under bridges where guards stood, staring out toward the south where shadows still lingered. In the hills of Latium, farmers bent to their fields, hands deep in the dark soil. The grain had to be tended, no matter what news came from the wars. Yet each stroke of the plough felt heavier, as though grief pressed on their shoulders as surely as the yoke pressed on the oxen. A farmer might straighten his back, wiping sweat from his brow, and glance toward the horizon, muttering a name, a son, a brother, lost at Cannae. Then he would lower his eyes again and continue, for life must be sown even in the ashes of despair. Priests moved slowly up the steps of the Capitoline Hill. The great temple to Jupiter loomed above the city, its columns catching the dim light of dawn. Inside, the air was thick with incense. Old men chanted prayers, their voices trembling not from age alone, but from fear. They laid offerings of grain, wine and honey upon the altar, their hands shaking as they begged the gods not to abandon the city. Outside, a small crowd knelt, lips whispering fragments of prayers. Some asked for vengeance, others for mercy, but all asked for Rome to endure. Night, when it fell, was heavier still. Across Rome, candles flickered behind shutters, faint yellow glows against the dark. Women sat with their weaving, though their hands were slower now, distracted by the silence of empty chairs. Children slept uneasily, some murmuring in dreams of battles they had never seen but had heard too much about. Dogs barked softly in the distance, their sounds echoing down empty streets. Above, the stars glittered, cold, eternal, silent, as if indifferent to human suffering, and in Apulia the battlefield itself lay hushed. The cries of war had long since faded, but the earth still bore witness. The grass was trampled, the soil stained. Survivors wandered still, some Romans, some allies wounded in body and in spirit. One soldier, limping with a broken spear shaft as a crutch, whispered the name of his brother with each step, as though the syllables themselves might keep him alive. Another, lying beside the river, stared upward at the sky. "Why not me too?" he asked softly. Yet the sky gave no answer. Sailors in Ostia, Rome's port, carried news more swiftly than land. Ships arrived with whispers of Hannibal's movements, of cities uncertain whether to stay loyal to Rome. At the docks, men hauled crates of grain and amphorae of wine, but they paused often to listen, to catch fragments of gossip. A Capua may betray us, a Syracuse may waver, a Hannibal marches still. Each rumour was like a gust of cold wind through the city, chilling hearts that were already heavy. Yet among the despair, something subtle stirred. Rome, though shaken, did not collapse. In the Senate, the old men debated not with surrender, but with grim determination. Cicadas chirped outside the Curia as senators argued into the night. "We must not falter," said one, his voice hoarse, hoarse, hoarse. "If Rome falls now, it will be because we have given up, not because we have been beaten." Another struck the floor with his staff. "Erase new legions. Call forth the boys, the old men, anyone who can stand. Rome is not finished." And so new decrees went forth. Messengers ran through the city, past bakeries, past taverns, past weary guards at the gates. Boys barely grown were summoned to training fields. Old veterans who had long laid down their arms were called again to service. Families wept anew, but they obeyed, for Rome asked much, and Rome was everything. The day stretched on like this. Heavy, sorrowful, yet unbroken. Farmers planted, fishermen cast their nets. Priests prayed, mothers rocked their children. Soldiers trained, even with the weight of grief pressing down. Life did not end. It merely slowed, softened, became dreamlike, as if the whole city was holding its breath. The ashes of hope were scattered. Yes, but beneath them glowed small sparks. A child, watching his father sharpen a plough, whispered, "One day I will fight for Rome." A mother, clutching her infant, whispered, "You will live, my little one. Rome will live for you." A sailor, pushing his boat into the sea, whispered, "The tides turn, always." Thus the Republic endured, even in despair. The Battle of Cannae had been a night without stars, but even the darkest night cannot last forever. Rome's spirit, though shaken, though scarred, remained. Bow-scarred remained. And in the silence after the storm, one could almost hear it. The faint, steady heartbeat of a city that refused to die. The years after Cannae unfolded not in triumph nor in swift ruin, but in a slow, patient endurance that seemed almost beyond human strength. Rome had been dealt a wound so deep that lesser cities would have bled to death in silence, yet Rome did not fall. Instead, she bent, like a great old tree swayed by storm winds, groaning, creaking, losing branches, but her roots held. In the streets of Rome, life was marked by the constant shadow of absence. Markets still opened each morning, stalls arranged with figs, cheeses, olives and bread, but the buyers and sellers moved as though under a heavy weight. A fruit seller might greet a customer with a quiet nod instead of laughter. A butcher might sharpen his knife slower than before, eyes far away, thinking of a son who once helped him at the stall, but now lay beneath Apulian soil. Yet still, trade went on. People bought food, carried it home, cooked meals and shared them with neighbours. The city, though grieving, did not starve itself of life. Farms across Latium showed the same quiet strength. Men tilled their fields even as tears dampened the soil. Boys too young only a year ago now guided ploughs while their mothers walked beside them, sowing grain into the furrows. The oxen moved steadily, their hooves pressing deep into the earth, as though reminding the farmers that life beneath the sky does not stop for sorrow. And in the evenings, when the light faded, families gathered by their hearths. The bread was plain, the wine thin, but there was comfort in eating together, in reminding one another that Rome still breathed. The Senate, though battered, became the heart of this endurance. Within the Curia, voices were hoarse with grief, but unbroken in resolve. Cicadas sang outside in the summer heat, while senators argued late into the night. "We cannot meet Hannibal in open battle again," said one, "but we can wear him down. Deny him food, deny him food, deny him allies, deny him rest." Another raised his hand toward the heavens. "Rome has been beaten, but Rome is not defeated. The gods test us, but we shall not yield." Decisions were slow, painful, but each carried the weight of survival. And so a strategy emerged, cautious, deliberate, stubborn. Fabius Maximus, the Ercunctator, the delayer, became Rome's quiet guide. He counselled patience, shadow Hannibal, cut his supplies, refuse his temptations to open battle. Many mocked him at first. Are we Romans or cowards hiding behind hills? Yet as the seasons turned, his wisdom took root. Hannibal raged across the countryside, burning fields, but Rome refused to meet him on his terms. Farmers might see their grain destroyed, their barns in ashes, but they planted again, season after season, knowing that endurance itself was their weapon. The common folk bore the greatest burden. Mothers gave their sons to new levies, watching them march away with wooden shields and worn sandals, tears hidden behind forced smiles. Old men took up arms once more, leaning on spears with hands that had long since forgotten the weight. Even boys in their mid-teens were pressed into service, their voices not yet deep, their eyes not yet hardened. In every house sorrow deepened, but with it a strange pride. Rome asked everything, and Rome was everything, and Rome was everything. In the ports, sailors became messengers of survival. At Ostia, ships carried grain from allies in Sicily, Sardinia, and even from Egypt. Dockworkers moved like ants, hauling sacks of wheat and barrels of oil. The Tiber swelled with traffic, barges pushing upriver toward the city. Each sack of grain was more than food. It was proof that Rome still had friends, that the world had not abandoned her. Sailors, rough and sunburned, told stories at taverns of distant lands still loyal, of merchant princes who whispered, "A Rome will rise again." Religion, too, played its quiet part. On the Capitoline Hill, priests led processions by torchlight. Citizens followed with olive branches, their steps soft against the stone. Hymns rose in the night air, trembling but steady. The smell of incense drifted across the city, clinging to hair and clothes. Women pressed their foreheads to the temple steps, whispering prayers for sons at war. Children clutched little figurines of gods, eyes wide with both fear and faith. Rome's spirit, invisible yet palpable, gathered in those rituals. It was as if the people whispered to the heavens, "We are still here." Beyond the city, the countryside bore scars of fire and ruin. Villages burned, vineyards cut down, fields trampled by Hannibal's elephants and horses. Yet in the ruins, life returned. A farmer's wife might plant new vines in the ashes of her husband's land. A shepherd might lead his flock into hills untouched by fire, whistling softly to keep his own heart steady. The earth itself seemed to answer, sprouting green shoots where blackened ground had been. Meanwhile, within the hearts of soldiers, endurance became a quiet prayer. In campfires scattered across Italy, men sat polishing shields, whispering of home. "I dream of the smell of my wife's bread," said one. "I dream of my boy chasing geese by the river," said another. And then silence would fall, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant call of owls. They dreamed, but they also drilled. They marched. They watched. They waited. Rome's new legions were not yet polished, but they were stubborn, and stubbornness itself became a weapon. As the years passed, Hannibal's victories grew quieter. He still roamed, still threatened, but his strength began to wane. Cities he had hoped would rise with him stayed loyal to Rome. Supplies ran thinner, his men grew weary, and Rome, though scarred, grew stronger. Each season saw new recruits, new harvests, new ships docking at Ostia. It was not glory that sustained Rome now, but something deeper, something slower, the simple, steady refusal to die. Children grew up in those years with Hannibal's name as a shadow over their cradles. Boys who had been toddlers at Cannae now practiced with wooden swords in courtyards, watched by mothers who whispered, "One day you will fight for Rome." Girls carried water from wells, learning the patience their mothers had mastered, their eyes already old with responsibility. Rome's next generation was being forged not in triumph, but in endurance, and so the long struggle stretched on. Days melted into months, months into years. Phew. The sound of hammers on shields, the cries of farmers in their fields, the chants of priests in their temples. all blended into one great, quiet chorus. Rome endured, not with splendor, but with silence, with sacrifice, with a strength that was less like fire and more like stone. The ashes of hope began to glow again, faintly, gently, like embers waiting for breath. And though Hannibal still lingered in Italy, Rome was learning the lesson she would never forget, that her power was not only in her armies, nor in her wealth, but in the stubborn, unyielding spirit of her people. The years after Cannae stretched long, heavy, and strangely quiet, as if all of Italy held its breath. Rome, wounded yet unbroken, began to live in a rhythm of sorrow mixed with stubborn labour. To wander her streets or fields was to see a people who carried pain as naturally as a cloak, yet still rose each morning to meet the day. In the homes of Rome, mothers became the silent anchors of survival. At dawn, a woman would sit by a loom, the shuttle moving back and forth with slow steadiness. En preux, each thread drawn was a prayer, each cloth woven a hope that her absent husband or son might return to wear it. Beside her, a small child might play with scraps of yarn, tugging at the bright threads, laughing without yet knowing the meaning of loss. Older daughters, their fingers nimble, learned to weave alongside their mothers, humming soft songs while the fabric grew beneath their touch. In those quiet chambers, grief and love intertwined, producing garments heavy with meaning, garments of endurance, garments. Fathers who had once been proud warriors found themselves at home with the youngest children, teaching them simple lessons that had nothing to do with swords. An old man might trace letters in ash on the hearthstone, showing a boy how to shape the name of Rome with his finger, the name of Rome with his finger. Another might lead his granddaughter into a courtyard, pointing out the constellations as the night sky glimmered above, whispering stories of gods and heroes, teaching her that the stars still shone even in times of sorrow. Schools, though smaller and thinner in number, continued to gather children. In the morning, boys would sit cross-legged on the ground while a weary tutor recited words of Latin and Greek. The scratching of wax tablets echoed softly, mixed with giggles when mistakes were made. Yet even in those small lessons, there was something larger at work. Rome was teaching her children not just letters and numbers, but the endurance of discipline, the slow patience of learning. Girls who did not attend such schools learned their own lessons at home: how to grind grain, how to tend fires, how to keep households alive when men were gone. Beyond the walls of Rome, farmers returned again and again to ruined lands. A field burned by Hannibal's men was not left barren for long. Instead, families gathered, men and women side by side, digging into blackened soil with hoes and spades. Children carried baskets of seed, their little feet trampling the ash as they went. Work was exhausting, but they pressed on, knowing that if the earth was faithful, grain would rise again. At night, sitting on stones by the edges of their fields, they shared small loaves of bread, eating with quiet pride. The earth has not abandoned us, they would whisper. In some places, whole villages had been destroyed, yet rather than scatter, the people returned. They rebuilt walls from charred stones, repaired roofs with reeds and clay, carved out new hearths in blackened homes. Women sang as they worked, lullabies turned into work songs, their voices carrying across the ruins. Children chased one another through the half-built streets, laughing in defiance of sorrow. The rebirth of a village was slow, but each new wall raised was an act of defiance, a message to Hannibal that Rome's people could not be burned out of existence. Meanwhile, the sailors of Ostia and other ports carried Rome's survival across the sea. Their taverns filled at night with the roar of voices, songs of salt and wind, of storms weathered and cargo saved. A sailor, sunburnt and scarred, might slap a table with his hand and cry, "We bring grain from Sicily. Rome will not starve tonight." Another would boast of seeing Egyptian ships in the distance, sails swollen with wind, bringing oil and barley for Rome. They drank watered wine and sang louder, their songs carrying out into the harbour, where ships swayed gently, each mast a prayer of endurance. Even the Tiber itself seemed to join in the struggle. Barges moved slowly upriver, piled high with sacks of wheat, barrels of oil, amphorae of wine. Along its banks, dockworkers hauled goods with straining backs, their sweat shining in the sunlight. At the edges of the water, children splashed and played, chasing each other with reeds, while mothers washed clothes and exchanged news. The river carried Rome's survival like a living artery, feeding the city one shipment at a time. Religious life deepened in those years. Priests walked in solemn processions, their voices chanting hymns older than memory. In the glow of torchlight, citizens carried offerings: a handful of grain, a small carved idol, a lock of hair. Mothers knelt with children at the feet of Jupiter's statue, whispering prayers that the gods might spare their sons. The smell of incense and burning fat clung to their clothes, following them home, a reminder that divine ears still listened. In quiet corners of the city, women lit lamps before small household shrines, setting offerings of bread and honey for the spirits of their ancestors, asking them to watch over those far from home. Soldiers, scattered across camps in Italy, lived with dreams that blurred into one another. At night, under canvas tents, they shared memories. One soldier would speak of the smell of his wife's bread, another of the laughter of his little brother, another of the vineyards of his father's land. Silence would then fall deep and heavy until someone began to hum a tune, a lullaby remembered from childhood, soft and trembling. The others would listen, eyes closed, letting the song carry them back to hearths and fields. And yet they did not break, they trained with dull persistence. Shields were lifted again and again in practice. Spears were thrown at straw targets. Marching drills filled the days. They did not look for glory now, only survival. Each scarred, weary man became part of a wall that Rome slowly built around herself, a living wall of patience and discipline. The seasons passed. Winters brought cold winds, and yet farmers still sowed. Spring brought blossoms, delicate and white, across the countryside, and even in scarred villages, children picked flowers and tucked them into their hair. Summers brought harvests, smaller than before but still precious, and families gathered in fields to cut grain together, stacking sheaves beneath the hot sun. Autumn brought the crush of grapes, feet pressing down in vats, laughter mixing with tears as wine flowed once more. Life did not stop. Life bent but did not break. The children of Rome grew up in this long struggle. They learned early to carry burdens, to help their mothers fetch water, to guard goats, to mend torn cloaks. Boys whittled sticks into wooden swords, sparring in courtyards, pretending to be heroes of old. Girls wove garlands of flowers, then laid them at shrines, praying for safety and peace. Their games were quiet, their laughter subdued, but in their eyes was something old and steady, the inheritance of endurance, and slowly, Rome rose from her knees. Hannibal's army, once so fearsome, began to show cracks. Supplies grew thin. Allies hesitated. His men, worn by years far from home, began to grumble. Hannibal still burned fields, still prowled Italy like a wolf, but the wolf was growing lean. Rome's endurance, silent and stubborn, was becoming its own weapon. The city that had nearly died was alive again, not in triumph, not in brilliance, but in the simple, stubborn acts of daily life. In mothers weaving, in sailors singing, in farmers planting, in priests chanting, in children playing Tosa. Rome's greatness was not in the moment of Cannae, nor in the thunder of armies, but in this quiet refusal to vanish. And as the years stretched on, the embers of hope glowed warmer, carried not by speeches or victories, but by the rhythm of daily lives, the small, steady heartbeat of a city that would not die. In the long hush after Cannae, when Rome's heart beat slow and heavy with grief, there arose the faintest glimmer of light, so soft at first it seemed like nothing more than a whisper on the wind. That whisper was a man's name, carried from street to street, from camp to camp. Scipio. Publius Cornelius Scipio, still young, still more a dream than a legend, but already walking with the quiet fire of destiny in his steps. He was not yet the grand commander the histories would later praise, but in the wake of Rome's darkest hour, he began to gather what remained of her courage. His voice, calm and steady, carried something the people longed for, not boasts of victory, not hollow promises, but the assurance that Rome could endure, and in enduring, rise. In the city streets, where merchants still laid out their baskets of figs and olives, despite the weight of sorrow in the air, whispers spread about Scipio's speeches to the soldiers. Mothers, weaving cloth by lamplight, leaned closer to one another and murmured, "They say he swore that Rome will not bow." Children, overhearing, sat straighter, imagining a figure who would shield them from fear. In taverns by the Tiber, where sailors sang of winds and storms, a new verse was added to their songs, rough and halting, but carrying hope, of the young Scipio who dared to face shadows with unshaken eyes. Farther afield, in the countryside where farmers still patched the scorched earth with new vines and olive saplings, Scipio's name became a promise. As men bent to their work, pressing seeds into soil with calloused fingers, they spoke softly of him. "If the Republic holds men like him," one farmer said, wiping sweat from his brow, "then the land will bloom again." His children, carrying baskets of fresh water to the fields, repeated the name as if it were a prayer, rolling it like a pebble on their tongues. Scipio, Scipio, Scipio. In the barracks where weary soldiers lingered, Scipio's presence was even stronger. He walked among them not as a distant commander, but as one of their own. He spoke of discipline, of honour, but most of all of Rome herself, as if she were a living mother who watched them all. She breathes through your strength, he told them in a voice low enough to feel like a secret. Each of you is her breath, her heartbeat. You are Rome. The men, hardened by loss, felt tears stir in their eyes, though they did not show them. That night, as they polished their swords and mended their shields, it was with a steadier hand. Yet Scipio's rise was not only in words. His keen mind stirred with strategy even in youth. He studied maps under torchlight, tracing the jagged lines of the Italian hills, the wide sweep of the Mediterranean Sea. He spoke with sailors who had crossed to Carthage and back, listened to merchants who knew the rhythms of trade, learned from farmers the lay of the land. Where others saw only fields, he saw terrain for armies. Where others saw a shoreline, he saw the tide of war that could shift with ships and sails. But what set him apart was not only his mind, but his gentleness toward the ordinary lives around him. He watched children play in courtyards, their laughter carrying against the stone. He listened to mothers sing lullabies while weaving at twilight. He saw the tired priests in temples, still raising smoke toward the gods, and he bowed his head with them, his lips murmuring the same prayers. To Scipio, Rome was not an abstract power. She was these people, these voices, these fragile yet unyielding acts of daily endurance. As seasons turned, the rumour of his growing command reached every corner of Italy. Sailors docking at Ostia brought tales of his resolve. Farmers passing through markets heard of his courage and carried the story back to their villages. Even in distant taverns, where shepherds warmed themselves with cups of wine, his name was spoken with a kind of reverence. Perhaps, an old shepherd mused one evening as smoke curled from his pipe, the gods have not abandoned us. Perhaps they have given us this young Scipio. Night after night, the stars wheeled silently over Rome. In the fields of Apulia, where the ghosts of Cannae still lingered, owls called from the dark. In the city, oil lamps flickered in narrow windows, keeping the shadows at bay. And somewhere in the quiet between Scipio stood, a man not yet great, yet carrying within him the promise of Rome's renewal. His was a light not blazing but steady, a star rising slowly, tenderly in the vast dark sky. And so it was that Rome, though still bowed with grief, began to lift her eyes again. Not toward distant, unreachable triumphs, but toward the soft glow of one young man's courage. In that glow, fragile yet unbroken, the people found warmth. They whispered his name as if it were both shield and fire. Scipio, the star rising. The weeks after Cannae had stretched into months, and with them a silence lay upon Rome. It was the kind of silence that clung to stones and lingered in alleyways, a silence not of peace, but of mourning, of hearts too weary to speak. The markets were open, yes. Baskets of figs and jars of oil still appeared beneath awnings. The scent of bread still drifted from bakers' ovens, but the voices that once rose in lively barter were hushed. Mothers pulled their shawls closer as they crossed the forum. Children played, though their games now carried a sharper edge. Mock battles fought with wooden swords where the Carthaginian always seemed too strong. And in this hush, Scipio's name began to grow. He was still so young, barely past the age when boys left their fathers' houses. Yet something in him carried the gravity of years. His footsteps through the camps were measured, his eyes steady, his words carrying that rare tone which does not command through force, but through calm certainty. Soldiers who had known only despair after the slaughter at Cannae found themselves listening to him, and in listening, believing again. It was not grand speeches that stirred them. It was his manner of speaking, as though Rome herself were seated among them, listening. "You are not broken," he told a group of weary men by the fire one night. "You are her hands, her shield, her breath. While you still stand, Rome breathes." The flames flickered on their worn faces, and for the first time in months, some of them smiled. In the city, mothers weaving in dim courtyards whispered his name. As they bent over their looms, the rhythm of thread against wood softened their sorrow. One woman, her husband lost at Cannae, lifted her spindle and told her little boy, "Remember this name, my son, Scipio. He will guard Rome for you." The child, not yet old enough to understand war, repeated it as though it were a lullaby, his small voice weaving it into the rhythm of her loom. Priests, too, burdened with the endless rituals of supplication, found solace in his presence. They burned incense at Jupiter's temple, the smoke rising into the blue Roman sky, and murmured blessings over the city. In their hearts, they prayed not only for the gods to grant strength, but that this young man's courage might be Rome's answer to divine silence. Farmers tending vines that had been burned by Hannibal's raiding parties spoke of him as they repaired their trellises. One old farmer, stooped but steady, leaned on his staff and said, "It is not the first time the land has been scarred. We plant again, always." Perhaps this Scipio is like the seed, small now, but destined to grow taller than the storm that tries to uproot him. His sons listened, shoulders broad from work, and when they returned to their hoeing, they did so with more vigour. We did so with more vigour. By the harbours of Ostia, sailors loading grain ships from Sicily sang rough songs as they worked, their voices rising above the creak of ropes and the slap of waves. Their verses spoke of storms and winds, but soon a new line joined them. A verse about Scipio, who would carry Rome across seas darker than the Tyrrhenian. The rhythm of oars matched the beat of his name, rowers dipping and pulling as though his spirit steadied even the tide. Children in Rome's narrow streets played their games with new endings. Where once they had shouted Hannibal's name as the victor, now they began to cry as Scipio, as the defender who stood tall at the gates. Their laughter rang in courtyards where pigeons fluttered down to peck at crumbs, and mothers, overhearing, paused in their chores, hearts easing for a moment. Soldiers who marched beneath Scipio's gaze found themselves straightening their backs, not out of fear, but out of pride. He walked among them with the air of one who belonged not above but beside them. When he spoke of strategy, he bent over the maps with them, tracing the lines of rivers and mountains, asking their thoughts. "You know this ground," he told a grizzled veteran from Apulia. "What would you do here?" The man blinked, startled to be asked, then answered. In that moment, he felt himself more than a soldier. He felt himself a citizen, part of Rome's beating heart, and so day by day Rome shifted. The sorrow did not vanish. Too many sons were buried beneath the soil for that, but into the cracks of grief a green shoot of hope pushed upward. A mother at her loom, a farmer in his field, a sailor on his deck, a priest at his altar. Each carried in his or her breast the fragile ember of belief, and that ember bore the shape of Scipio's name. At night, when the city's lamps glowed softly in the windows and the stars wheeled silently over the Tiber, Scipio himself stood often at the edge of the river. He watched the water flow, dark and endless, and thought of Rome's fate. In the distance, dogs barked, and the faint sound of flutes drifted from a tavern. Somewhere, a child cried, then was soothed by his mother's song. These were the sounds of Rome, ordinary, fragile, enduring, and in his heart, Scipio swore he would guard them, even if it cost him his life. The people did not know all his thoughts, nor did they need to. What they knew was enough. A young man had risen from their midst, not with boasts but with steady light. He was a star, not blazing yet, but rising quietly against the darkness. And all of Rome, in fields and temples, in harbours and homes, turned their eyes upward, following that light. The years after Cannae had been like a long winter of the soul. Rome seemed broken, stretched thin and bruised, yet beneath the weariness something faint but steady had survived. In the forum, old senators walked with bent backs and heavy steps, yet still gathered each dawn to argue about the state's survival. Farmers had returned to their ruined fields, tilling ashes and stones, trying to coax wheat once more from the scarred earth. Mothers still spun wool in the doorways of small homes, singing lullabies to babies who would never know the terror of Hannibal's elephants. Sailors mended nets at the Tiber's edge, casting their eyes southward, whispering of Carthage's ships. And in this time of doubt, a new figure began to shine, a young man, quiet at first, but burning with a hidden flame. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He had been only a boy when Hannibal came thundering over the Alps, yet he had grown into a commander with clear eyes and a strange, calm courage. Rome, weary and in need of hope, entrusted him with a task most thought impossible: to lead armies into Spain, where Hannibal's brothers held Carthage's strength. Many feared it was madness, yet Scipio accepted with a serenity that seemed almost otherworldly. He did not rage like other generals, nor boast of thunderous victories. He spoke softly, with a steady confidence that calmed those around him. The ships set sail under the pale dawn, their sails catching the sea breeze. The soldiers aboard were not like those of earlier years, full of pride and swagger. They were sons of farmers and shepherds, hardened by loss, their eyes deep and watchful. They sang low songs as the waves rocked the decks, songs of their villages, their wives, their children left behind. At night, as the stars spread wide above the sea, some lay awake whispering prayers to Jupiter, to Mars, to their household gods. Others simply stared into the dark horizon, wondering if they would ever see Rome again. In Spain, the air smelled of olives and dust. The hills rolled in quiet gold under the sun, and villages clung to the earth like small birds to a branch. It was here that Scipio first tested his gift. He moved not only with military cunning, but with a gentleness of spirit that won the loyalty of allies. He greeted local chiefs with respect, he spared civilians, he treated the wounded with compassion. The men under him began to feel that they were not merely fighting to survive, but fighting to restore the dignity of Rome. Back in Italy, whispers began to return across the sea. Stories drifted into the Forum. Scipio has taken New Carthage. Scipio's men fight with joy. Scipio has given Rome back its pride. Old senators leaned forward on their benches, listening with cautious hope. In taverns, sailors told wide-eyed children about the young general who seemed blessed by the gods. Farmers resting from their labours shared the tales as though passing cups of cool water to parched lips. For the first time in years, Rome's heartbeat grew steadier. The dread that had hung like a mist began to lift. Little by little, there was still war, there was still loss. But now, in the quiet rhythms of daily life, hope began to weave itself back into the fabric of the city. And so, under soft skies and rolling seas, the tide of fate began to turn. The years that stretched after the shattering day of Cannae were heavy and slow, like a long shadow falling across Rome. Grief had dulled the voices of its people, and yet, beneath the weight of loss, something stubborn still flickered. Rome endured even in silence, even in hunger. In the Forum, the marble steps were worn thin by sandals, not from the bustle of festivals, but from the tired feet of senators, magistrates, and citizens who gathered each morning to debate survival itself. Cloaked in the soft grey of age, old men argued, their hands trembling with both weakness and resolve. They had seen their sons fall, their villas burn, their lands stolen by Hannibal's horsemen. Yet still they argued, still they clung to the Republic's battered heart. The bronze statues of earlier heroes stood above them, half green with weather, silent watchers over a city that refused to die. Beyond the Forum, in the countryside of Latium, farmers walked their ruined fields. Burned stalks and scattered stones told the story of armies that had passed like fire. Yet the farmers bent low again, pushing seeds into the soil with rough hands. Perhaps this year the earth will forgive us, they whispered to their wives and children. The rhythm of farming returned slowly, like a hesitant heartbeat, like a hesitant heart. Chickens scratched in the dirt near broken fences. Goats bleated as shepherd boys tried to guide them to fresh pasture. These small, stubborn acts of daily life became Rome's quiet defiance against despair. Mothers, too, played their part in the endurance of the city. Sitting in doorways, they spun wool into thread, weaving tunics not only for their children but also for soldiers at the front. Each thread carried a prayer, and may this cloth guard my son, may this warmth guide him home. The hum of spinning wheels blended with the soft voices of lullabies, sung not to banish fear, but to hold it gently until it faded into sleep. By the Tiber's banks, sailors mended nets and patched sails. Their boats were small compared to the mighty war galleys, yet they carried grain, olive oil, and whispered news from distant coasts. In the taverns of the harbour, they sang rough songs at night, songs of storms and sea winds, but also of a young general whose name was spreading like dawn light across the Mediterranean. Scipio. He had been little more than a boy when Hannibal crossed the Alps, yet the years of fear had shaped him into something Rome scarcely dared hope for. Scipio spoke not with thunder, but with calm. His voice carried no bluster, no arrogance, only a clarity that made his men believe. Where other generals barked orders, Scipio offered trust. Where others sought glory, he sought Rome's healing. When he was entrusted with command in Spain, many shook their heads in doubt. The boy will be swallowed by Carthage's armies, they muttered. But Scipio went quietly, accepting the task as if he had been waiting for it all his life. The journey across the sea was long, the waves restless. Roman soldiers sat along the decks, their armour catching the sunlight in dull gleams. They were not the bright, eager soldiers of the Republic's early pride. They were weary sons of farmers and shepherds, men who had lost brothers, fathers and homes. Yet under Scipio's gaze, something within them stirred again. At night, when the sea spread wide and dark beneath the stars, the soldiers whispered to one another. Some told stories of their villages, olive groves near Tusculum, sheep pastures in Samnium, vineyards in Campania. Others murmured prayers, offering small promises to Mars and Jupiter, or even to their household spirits, that if they returned alive, they would build altars in thanks. The younger soldiers lay awake, staring at the sky, wondering if the gods were watching them sail into fate. Sight. Spain, when it rose before them, shimmered in sunlight. Its hills rolled golden under the sun, its air scented with olives, dust and wild herbs. Villages clung to rocky slopes, their houses whitewashed and humble. Here lived farmers who tilled soil not unlike Italy's, shepherds who guided goats across rough hillsides, fishermen who cast nets into shining rivers. And here also camped Carthaginian soldiers, hard and disciplined, who had long held Spain as their fortress. Scipio landed with quiet purpose. He studied the land, listened to his scouts, but also spoke with the people. Unlike many commanders, he spared civilians, respected temples, and honoured local customs. Spanish farmers, at first wary, soon began to whisper, "This Roman is different." Mothers, who had hidden their children in fear, began to watch Scipio's men march with less dread. Even some chiefs, hardened by years of war, offered alliance. It was as if Scipio carried not only the sword, but also the olive branch. When he struck, it was with brilliance. At New Carthage, the heart of Carthaginian power in Spain, he moved swiftly, like a sudden storm breaking summer's stillness. Roman soldiers, inspired by their young general, stormed the city. Gates that seemed unbreakable fell, and in a blaze of courage Rome seized a jewel of Carthage's empire. News travelled across the sea with the swiftness of gulls on the wind. Sailors returned to Ostia with wide eyes, telling anyone who would listen, "Scipio has taken New Carthage." In the forum, senators leaned forward, their weariness momentarily forgotten. Priests lit lamps in temples, whispering prayers of thanks. Mothers told their children, theirs, hope. Hope? Rome has not lost everything. Children too carried the story. In the narrow streets, boys played at being soldiers again, one declaring himself Scipio, the others pretending to storm walls of clay and stone. Their laughter, absent for so long, returned like the sound of bells after silence. In the countryside, farmers repeated the tale as they sowed seed. "Scipio fights for us," they said, their hands pressing grain into the soil. In taverns, sailors sang rough songs of Scipio's victory, their voices carrying out over the harbour waters, rising like an omen of Rome's recovery. In Spain, Scipio did not rest. He treated his soldiers not merely as tools of war, but as men with hearts and burdens. He listened to their worries, shared their hardships, and gave them victories that seemed touched by divine favour. His presence lifted spirits like the sunrise lifts mist. The men began to believe that Rome's darkest days were not her last. And slowly, in the quiet rhythms of everyday life, wool spun in doorways, prayers whispered in temples, children's games in alleyways, sailors' songs by the harbour. The great truth settled like evening light over Rome. The tide was turning. The years turned, slow and heavy, like the grinding of ancient stones. From the smoke of Cannae to the brightness of Spain, Rome had stumbled, endured, and begun to rise again. Now, at last, the long duel between Rome and Carthage drifted toward its final act, an act written not only in the clash of legions, but also in the quiet endurance of daily life, in the whispered prayers of mothers, in the patience of farmers, in the small songs of children who had never seen peace but still dreamed of it. Scipio, grown older now, carried not only the weight of command, but also the calmness of a man who had seen suffering and chosen hope. His eyes, dark and steady, did not burn with anger as Hannibal's did. Instead, they glowed with resolve. Where Hannibal had fought to shatter Rome, Scipio fought to restore it. The legions followed him across the sea once more. Sailors hauled ropes on creaking decks, their voices calling out in rhythm with the waves. Soldiers, hardened by Spain's battles, sat polishing their shields, whispering prayers to household gods. On the shorelines of Italy, mothers stood with children at their skirts, watching the sails disappear into the horizon. The sea, restless and endless, carried Rome's last gamble toward Africa. Carthage still stood proud. Its harbours were crowded with ships, its streets rich with markets where traders sold ivory, spices, and fine cloth. Yet shadows haunted the city. Farmers from the countryside spoke of Roman raids, sailors murmured of Scipio's victories, and priests in Carthage's great temples wondered whether their gods had turned away. Mothers, like those in Rome, held their children close at night, fearful of what the winds would bring. When the two great generals at last faced one another, Hannibal and Scipio, it was as if all the years of struggle had led to this single moment, this single plain near Zama. Hannibal, older now, his once fiery strength carved by years of battle, stood with elephants and veterans at his side. But Scipio stood with legions disciplined and calm, Spain's victories echoing in their hearts. The morning sun stretched over the plain, gilding the grass, glinting off bronze and steel. But before the first horn was sounded, there was silence. There was silence. Farmers in distant fields paused, leaning on their hoes, feeling some tremor in the earth. In Rome, children played in courtyards, unaware that their futures were being decided far away. In Carthage, women carried water from wells, glancing at the sky as though the clouds themselves might carry news. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the battle began. Elephants thundered forward, their trumpets shattering the silence, but Scipio's men stood calm, parting their lines to let the beasts pass harmlessly. Hannibal's veterans pressed hard, but the Roman legions bent like reeds and then pushed back, steady as the tide. Dust rose, shouts echoed. The ground shook beneath thousands of feet. At last, when the struggle swayed uncertainly, Scipio's cavalry, swift and fierce, swept in from behind. Carthage's army faltered, then broke. The dust settled, and Hannibal, the great lion of Carthage, stood defeated. His eyes, weary and proud, gazed across the field as though he had always known this day must come. Scipio, respectful even in triumph, offered peace. Back in Rome, the news spread like fire through the forum. Old men wept openly. Mothers clasped children to their chests and whispered, "It is over. Rome has survived." Priests lit incense in every temple, the smoke rising soft into the twilight sky. Sailors in harbours sang of Scipio's victory, their voices carrying over the waves, blending with the cries of gulls. Farmers, hearing the tidings, dug into the earth with renewed strength, planting not only grain but also hope for their children's children, and yet, in Carthage, silence hung heavy. Families mourned sons lost at Zama. Priests stood before altars that no longer seemed to answer. Mothers hushed their children, promising them safety even as they wondered what tomorrow would bring. The proud city endured, but its shadow had fallen. From that day forward, Rome's star burned brighter. It was not yet the empire of marble and emperors. It was still a republic of farmers and soldiers, sailors and mothers. Yet in the soft rhythm of daily life, in wool spun at doorways, in prayers whispered at dawn, in the quiet patience of fields, tilled again after war, Rome grew eternal. The tide of history had turned. The duel was over. And in the hush that followed, as night settled over both Rome and Carthage, the world itself seemed to exhale, carrying the soft truth that even in darkness, endurance could kindle light. Epilogue. And so, the Punic Wars faded into memory. Hannibal's shadow, once so vast it had seemed to darken all of Italy, slipped slowly into the past, leaving only echoes in marble halls and whispered legends by the hearth. Rome had endured, Rome had risen, and Rome would march into centuries more of triumph and sorrow. But for this moment, in the stillness after Zama, there was quiet. The farmers returned to their fields, sowing wheat where once battle lines had stretched. The soil, scarred and burnt, softened again under patient hands. Children who had grown up with fear in their hearts now chased one another through olive groves, their laughter replacing the thunder of hooves. Sailors hummed songs on the Tiber, their nets heavy with silver fish that gleamed under morning light. Priests lit incense in temples, their voices low and steady, as if even the gods themselves needed rest after so many years of war. And in homes both grand and humble, mothers laid their babies to sleep, telling them stories of heroes and endurance, but in tones soft enough that the harshness of battle would never disturb their dreams. Fathers leaned against doorways in the evening, watching lamps flicker in the streets of the eternal city, and thought not of conquest, but of peace, however brief, that wrapped the night. History would carry Rome onward, toward emperors, toward glory, toward decline, and toward rebirth. Yet here, at the close of this chapter, we leave the city not in the noise of marching legions, but in a lull of stillness. The moonlight lies across the 7 hills, the Tiber flows untroubled, and the people of Rome breathe together in the hush that follows survival. So let your mind drift with them now. Sail with the river's slow current, walk among olive trees in the silver dawn, hear the echo of distant bells fading into silence. The tale has been told, the city rests, and so may you. Sleep gently, as Rome itself settles into the long dream of eternity.